This subcommittee will come to order. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Congress first authorized a medical device user fee program in 2002 in the Medical Device User Fee and Modernization Act, MDUFA. We last reauthorized the program in the Medical Device User Fee Amendments of 2007, MDUFA, which expires September 30, 2012. While I'm glad that the FDA and industry have reached recently a proposed medical device user fee agreement, the committee did not receive it by the January 15, 2012 deadline as set in statute. As it is already late, I would encourage FDA and the administration to expedite their review of the agreement so that the committee receives it at the earliest possible date. The proposed agreement will provide $595 million in user fees for FY 2013 through FY 2017, a sum that is more than double the current user fee level of $287 million. A key goal of the agreement is to increase predictability and transparency. Under the agreement, together with regular congressional appropriations, FDA should be able to hire 240 full-time review process employees, including 140 reviewers specifically for devices over 5 years. The increased user fees will pay for additional training for device reviewers and information technology upgrades to improve the review process. With these new resources, FDA has agreed to measure review time in calendar days, not FDA days, which is an important step to providing increased predictability. Under the proposed agreement, FDA and industry will communicate more often and earlier in the review process, where FDA will provide the feedback that manufacturers need to go forward. The United States is the world leader in medical device innovation. This not only benefits patients who need new, innovative treatments, it benefits our economy. In 2008, according to the Lewin Group, the medical device industry employed 422,778 workers nationwide, paid $24.6 billion in earnings, and shipped $135.9 billion worth of products. In 2008, in my home state of Pennsylvania, the medical device industry employed 22,233 people and paid Pennsylvania workers over $1.1 billion in earnings. These are good jobs. Nationally, jobs in medical technology pay almost 40% higher compared to the national earnings average. What is best for patients and what is best for jobs is to have a device review process that is clear, transparent, predictable, and accountable. And I hope that that is what the proposed agreement accomplishes. I would like to thank all of our witnesses in today's panels. I'd like to yield the remaining time to Dr. Burgess, Vice Chairman of the committee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Dr. Shuren, again, thank you for being here. You're going to hear today some concerns from people on the dais and from our subsequent panel from patients and innovators. As the chairman points out, funding was increased in fiscal years 08 and fiscal year 2010 by nearly 35%. And during that time, the average review time for lower risk devices increased by 43%, higher risk devices by 75%. So we've got an official Washington conundrum. Resources are increasing, performance is decreasing. And you need to be the very best you can, but it doesn't look like we're there yet. Delays in reviews through inconsistency certainly harm public health, but they also stifle innovation and cost jobs. We don't want the FDA to approve anything that harms patients, and that is your mission. But a little predictability could go a long way. The industry should not have to double user fees in order to get the very basics of customer service. So the question is, have you become more interactive, predictable, and innovative? Those should be the goals of the basic agreement, but they also are tenets of a well-run organization. We worry about the jurisdictional creep that has been going on, where you seek to grab as much regulatory territory as possible, oftentimes through draft guidance, absent legislative direction. Things like mobile apps and laboratory developed tests are things that you want to do, but we're not sure you're doing what you're supposed to do. We shouldn't enable your efforts to duplicate efforts of other federal agencies. Mission creep may be a cry for help, and Doctor, this morning we're here to try to provide that help for you. But some days we wonder if you don't need a bigger check, but you need a check on what is exactly happening at the level of your agency. We want to help. I think we all admit that there are problems in our device approval regimen that hurts patients, and it's just critical that we get it right for them. So I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Pitts. I welcome everyone here for our third installment of the UFA hearings. Today we'll be discussing the reauthorization of the medical device user fee agreement known as MDUFA. And let me say at the outset that we're all very relieved and encouraged by the current circumstances. There was grave concern that the parties would be unable to reach a compromise, and I'm happy that things are moving forward. While there's still no legislative language, there's an agreement in principle that we'll be discussing at length. It includes $595 million in fees over 5 years, specific goals for total review times, additional meetings with sponsors, a third-party analysis of the FDA's review process, as well as other program improvements. In addition, I understand that the additional funding would allow FDA to hire over 200 new full-time workers by the end of the 5-year program. Now, we've consistently heard for a long time about the need for FDA to improve the predictability, consistency, and transparency of its pre-market review program. This agreement will not solve all of those issues overnight, but it certainly sets FDA on a good path moving forward with important tools and more resources at their disposal. It also provides the industry with some much-needed insight into the review process and better metrics to measure the FDA's performance, and these are quality enhancements that should allay those concerns. I know that Congress and the FDA greatly appreciate the industry's investment in this program. This proposal represents a strong compromise, and I commend the hard work of both parties in getting to this place. I'm confident will help the agencies continue to improve efficiencies. Let me also say that I've been encouraged by FDA's commitment both over the past year and as part of this user fee agreement to recognize the need for some internal transformations. Change doesn't happen overnight, and regardless, Dr. Shuren, your center has been more than willing to listen and learn from members, stakeholders, and industry on how to shift and adapt in ways to make these processes better for companies and consumers. You've recognized some of the inadequacies of the agency and maintained an open mind on fixing what's broken. At the same time, you've also maintained the policies that are important to patient safety and device effectiveness. You and the Commissioner were kind enough to visit my district and talk one-on-one with me and New Jersey companies about these processes, so I appreciate that, and I look forward to working with you to continue to improve the center. Today's hearing will also touch upon a number of FDA policy proposals from my Republican colleagues. In general, I have concerns with some of these bills, and I look forward to discussing them further. Specifically, I wonder whether these proposals could make it difficult for the agency to meet its negotiated commitments. I also think it's critical we understand at length the intended impact, justification, and potential unintended consequences of these proposals before moving forward. I'll just close by stating what I've said a number of times. I agree that MDUFA is of the utmost importance. I agree that FDA should facilitate an environment that doesn't create added unnecessary burdens upon innovating companies, but we must not make FDA policy changes at the expense of patient safety. The public health must be our #1 goal. Above all else, we need to take a long, hard look at any potential policy that could make it more difficult for FDA to protect patient safety. And I know there are a number of witnesses joining us today who will talk about that important aspect. I look forward to that. But I want to especially welcome Jim Schul, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, from Browns Mills, New Jersey, who's here to share his personal story. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And did anyone else want my time? No.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And now recognize the Chair Emeritus of the full committee, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes for opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to take 5 minutes. I believe I'm supposed to yield to Mr. Murphy, Dr. Murphy. I have an opening statement that I'll put in the record, but I hate to be the skunk at the garden party, but every now and then I am. These user fees are not something that have been on the books for 100 years. We first put them in place in 2002, and we've reauthorized them once. Currently, it's about $287 million, I believe. I think it is a lot to ask this committee to swallow a doubling of the user fee budget to almost $600 million. I checked yesterday, and I understand that it may be the tradition, but I couldn't find that any member or any staff member of the majority or the minority had been involved in these negotiations with the FDA and the industry. If we came in and asked to double the income tax receipts, we would be laughed out of Congress. And to have a proposal put forward that doubles the user fee with the performance or lack thereof that has accompanied the last 3 or 4 years is something that I'm not going to condone. Now, I haven't talked with Chairman Upton or Chairman Pitts, and I'm sure that there's another side to the story, but put me down as extremely skeptical that this is a good deal for the consumer or for the small medical device industry. I had a company in my office just this week, or late last week actually, that has been making a device and marketing it for 30 years, and all of a sudden now they've been asked to have to go through the entire pre-market approval process for something. I just don't accept that. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm extremely glad that you're holding this hearing, but don't ask this member to rubber stamp a doubling of a user fee when we have the program performance or lack thereof at this FDA. And with that, I would yield the balance of the time to Dr. Murphy of Pennsylvania.
I thank the gentleman. A few weeks ago, several of my colleagues and I met with Professor Ralph Hall, who will be testifying a little bit later today in a panel. At that meeting, Professor Hall explained how the review process of the FDA is driving investment in medical technologies overseas, as well as sending jobs overseas. Now, according to Professor Hall, 40% of venture capitalists have already reduced investment in medical technology in the United States, and many more are planning this. About 61% of venture capitalists cite regulatory challenges with the FDA as having the greatest impact on their investment decisions. Now, this may seem like financial jargon, but in reality it points to a tragic bottom line. No money, no research, no treatments, no cures. This is about saving lives of people with untreatable diseases who are waiting in line for Washington's rules and bureaucracy to get out of the way and for the treatments and cures to move forward. It is cruelty, not comfort, when a doctor must tell a patient that bureaucratic barriers prevent patients in the United States from getting the treatment that they need. We need to, and we must, help American patients have better access to the latest, safest medical advancements, while also improving FDA's review process to allow more investment in U.S. medical technology. It is something we ought to be doing out of compassion for people who are sick. And with that, I yield back to Mr. Barton.
I have no further comments. If other members, I'd be happy to yield. Mr. Rogers or Mr. Latta. Anybody? Then I yield back to the chairman. Ms. McMorris Rogers, if she has anything.
Tired.
No.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. Our goal today is to start the process of reauthorizing the Medical Device User Fee Act, and I commend FDA and the industry for finally coming together to agree on a user fee proposal. I know it was a hard compromise, and I look forward to seeing the details. But I'm pleased that there has been an agreement, because I have very little faith that Congress is going to provide the appropriations for the FDA to do the job without a user fee. I prefer we do it that way, and those who don't like the user fee will have to acknowledge that FDA will be short-funded and we won't get these devices approved as quickly as possible. The funds under this act will provide FDA's device program with critical dollars that enable the agency to fulfill its public health mission to ensure that only safe and effective medical devices are marketed in the U.S., That's our essential goal here. We should work together on a bipartisan basis to get it done. The real compassion of this country is to make sure that we could get drugs and devices that work and that are safe to consumers, not just to get them out on the marketplace, because it's no one's benefit to have drugs that are not safe or medical devices that are not safe or effective. The FDA, the device industry, and American patients are counting on us to do our job. I am concerned that some may try to hijack the reauthorization to advance proposals that would put the health of patients at risk. Last year, Republican members of the committee introduced a slate of 10 bills that would make significant and harmful changes, in my view, in FDA's device program. Unless we can reach consensus on these proposals, they should not be inserted into this must-pass reauthorization. The newspapers are full of articles about the dangers of improperly designed medical devices. The prestigious Institute of Medicine concluded that our medical device laws need to be significantly strengthened, but many of these bills ignore the need for reforms that would protect patients. Instead, they read like a wish list assembled by lobbyists for the device industry. The device industry claims FDA regulation is killing jobs, stifling innovation, depriving American patients of new medical devices. But there's no evidence to back these up except anecdotes. Anecdotes from some individual companies are not enough. And I think the industry knows that they need an FDA that's going to do its job if they're going to have credibility in the marketplace. I've been appalled by the quality of the so-called studies industry is using to advance these bills. Last July, I asked the editors of our nation's top medical journals to examine the methodology used in the leading industry papers asserting that FDA is too slow, burdensome, and unpredictable. The editors said there were serious methodological flaws in both studies: biased samples, small sample size, botched statistical analysis, just to name a few, rendering them essentially useless as part of any discussion of FDA's regulatory system. None of the editors felt that the methodology of these studies was worthy of publication in a peer-reviewed journal, and yet they're put forward as a reason why we ought to change the law here in Congress. Many in the device industry argue that Europe should be our model, and they say new technologies are available years before they're on the market in the U.S. But just yesterday, the New England Journal of Medicine published a study by Dr. Aaron Kesselheim finding numerous examples of high-risk devices that were first approved in the EU, but either showed no benefit or, worse, had substantial safety risk. I'm glad that Dr. Kesselheim is here today to testify about this study. FDA's job is to protect the public health. Part of advancing public health is helping manufacturers win approval for innovative new devices, but FDA's core responsibility is ensuring that only safe and effective devices are permitted on the market. When FDA falls short and allows dangerous devices like surgical mesh and metal hip implants to be implemented in patients, the suffering of victims can be incalculable. That's why I joined Mr. Pallone, Mr. Dingell, Mr. Gett in requesting that the committee hear from witnesses about the risks from dangerous devices. And I want to thank Subcommittee Chairman Pitts and Full Committee Chairman Upton for working with us to allow these witnesses to testify on the second panel. The reauthorization of MDUFA should be bipartisan, so I urge all members of the committee to work together on this critically important program. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Our first panel will have just one witness, Dr. Jeffrey Shuren, Director of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA. Dr. Shuren is accompanied today by Mr. Malcolm Bertoni, Assistant Commissioner for Planning for the Office of the Commissioner. We're happy to have you with us today, Dr. Shuren. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Summarize your testimony. Your written statement will be entered into the record.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I'm Dr. Jeff Shuren, the Center Director for the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH, at the FDA. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm pleased to tell you that on February 1, FDA and representatives from the medical device industry reached an agreement in principle on proposed recommendations for the reauthorization of the Medical Device User Fee Act, or MDUFA. These recommendations would authorize FDA to collect $595 million over 5 years to help fund a portion of the agency's medical device review program, with FDA agreeing to certain overall performance goals. The final details of the agreement will be resolved very soon, and as required by law, we'll hold a public meeting and seek public comment on the proposed package before sending a final package to Congress. When I came to CDRH in 2009, in response to concerns expressed by industry and others, we initiated a review of our device pre-market review programs. The following year, we released 2 reports that concluded, as I've testified before, that we had not done as good a job managing the review programs as we should have. The number one problem we found was insufficient predictability, which was leading to inefficiencies, higher costs for industry and FDA, and sometimes delays in bringing safe and effective products to market. In January 2011, we announced a plan with 25 specific actions that we would take that year to improve the predictability, consistency, and transparency of our pre-market programs. As of February 2012, 75% of these actions, plus 8 additional actions, are already completed or well underway. They are intended to create a culture change toward greater transparency, interaction, and the appropriate balancing of benefits and risks. They focus on assuring predictable and consistent decision-making and application of the least burdensome principle, and implementing more efficient regulatory processes. We believe these actions have had and will have a visible, positive impact by providing greater predictability about data requirements through guidance, reducing unnecessary or inconsistent data requests through training and policy and process changes, implementing policies that lead to appropriately balanced benefit-risk determinations, using external experts more extensively and effectively, creating incentives to conduct clinical studies first in the United States, speeding up clinical trial approval decisions, and implementing the innovation pathway. Preliminary data indicates that the actions we've taken have started to bear fruit. For example, the backlog of 510(k) submissions that had been steadily increasing from 2005 to 2010 decreased for the first time last year. However, we still have much work to do. Reauthorization of MDUFA will provide the resources that CDRH needs to continue improving the device review programs and help reduce the high staff turnover that has adversely affected review predictability and consistency. The proposed MDUFA recommendations we've agreed upon with industry will also include several important process improvements. For example, if a performance goal on a device application is missed, the MDUFA proposal would require FDA and applicants to work out a plan to complete work on the submission, ensuring that no submission is left behind, and requiring new substantive interaction between FDA and an applicant halfway through the targeted time for reviewing the application would help to assure sufficient time for the applicant to properly respond to appropriate questions. Clear criteria for when FDA will refuse to accept an incomplete application means more efficient use of resources to the benefit of both FDA and industry. These and other proposed enhancements are intended to achieve a shared outcome goal of reduced average total time to decision, which we and industry believe is an important indicator of a successful pre-market review program. The agreement in principle we've reached with industry strikes a careful balance between what industry agreed to pay and what FDA can accomplish with the amount of funding proposed. However, we are concerned that even if device user fee resources are increased under MDUFA 3, additional new legislative mandates imposed on CDRH could divert resources and undermine FDA's ability to achieve the new performance goals. When PDUFA was last reauthorized in 2007, the addition of new policy-related requirements ultimately resulted in FDA's drug review program having to temporarily suspend meeting its PDUFA review goals in order to meet the statutory mandates. We want to avoid such a situation so that CDRH can focus on meeting the ambitious new proposed MDUFA program goals and achieving timely patient access to safe and effective devices, which is an objective that we share with industry, healthcare practitioners, patients, and consumers, and I know you as well. Mr. Chairman, I commend the subcommittee's efforts, and I'm pleased to answer any questions the subcommittee may have.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and I'll now begin the questioning and recognize myself 5 minutes for that purpose. Dr. Shuren, Chairman Upton and I have set a deadline of reauthorizing the user fees by the end of June. We received the 3 other user fee proposals by January 15th, but we did not receive the medical device user fee proposal as required under statute. Given the need to reauthorize the user fees as soon as possible, let me ask you a two-part question. Number one, when will FDA send us the legislative language and proposed agreement for the medical device user fee so that the committee can begin its work? And two, what specific steps does the administration plan to take to expedite the process so the committee can get the device information as soon as possible?
So the plan we have put in place and what we've asked for the administration is for expedited review of our proposal so that we can get the proposal out to you and out to the public as we move into March. And so you'll be able to see what we're proposing. We'll get the public comments. We'll wrap up on that. We have to follow that process, and then we'll have the final package. But you will be able to see that proposed package, and our goal is to try to do that in the next few weeks.
By mid-March?
That's approximately the time, and that's what we've been asking the administration to support us in doing.
All right. The medical device legislation introduced by our committee members and Mr. Paulson of Minnesota contain critical improvements aimed at making FDA's regulation of medical devices, both pre-market and post-market, more predictable. This predictability is critical to getting life-saving devices to our nation's patients and their families, as we've heard from Marty Conger, Carol Murphy, and Pam Sagan at our O&I hearing in July. It is also critical to keeping medical device jobs in the United States, as we've heard from numerous innovators throughout the past year. We've heard some argue that these device bills aren't necessary because FDA is fixing the problem. That's a little hard to believe. For example, that's what FDA has told us about the pre-amendment Class 3 devices for the past 20 years. And the problem still isn't fixed. Class 3 devices are still going through the 510K process. Frankly, we don't have 20 years or even 6 months to wait for FDA to fix the problems. Our nation's patients and innovators need help now. So my question is, will you commit to working with us on this legislation so we can help our nation's patients and help keep American device jobs here in the United States?
Mr. Chairman, we would welcome the opportunity to work with you on legislation.
We'll follow up with that. Thank you. What is the status of the unique device identifier rule?
So we have completed the rule. It's now currently under review at the administration, and we're waiting for their approval to move forward with it.
5 years ago, the committee passed the reauthorization of the medical device user fee, and when we voted for that bill, we did so expecting that FDA would meet its end of the deal. It appears that that hasn't happened. FDA has failed to meet many of the MDUFA goals, and during the past 5 years, we've seen the total time it takes from submission to FDA decision rise dramatically. Given that track record, why should we believe that you're going to meet the goals you've agreed to in the proposed user fee package?
Well, I won't belabor the point that there are some things that, but for the User Fee Act, we would not have been able to enhance, but we agree. We're not happy with where the program is. Industry is not happy with where it is. There are fundamental problems right now. Some of that is on our part, and that's why I and the Center made a public commitment to make those changes and started last year, regardless of whether we saw user fee dollars or not, and we are moving forward on those. But at the same token, there are problems with the program that we cannot solve without funding. I have high staff turnover rate, just like the drug program had 10 years ago because of too much work on their plate. We don't have enough managers to provide good oversight. The ratios are running from 1 to 14 up to 1 to 25. Under a frontline manager. That's untenable in any business. And I can't solve that with changes in policies and processes. I can only change that with having the people to do the work, enough managers and enough staff to do the work. That's what comes out of the user fee dollars. And together, making those program improvements that we have underway, having the dollars from industry and having smart performance goals in place can help us achieve a successful program and the outcome we all want to see from device review.
I have just 20 seconds left. What metrics are included in the agreement to make sure you can meet your goal?
In the MDUFA agreement?
Yes.
Yeah, so there are performance goals that pertain to FDA time, but also to the average total time to the decision. So these are things that happen that are not quite under our control, but by putting in certain process improvements of greater engagement and interaction with industry, with the companies, as we move forward during the review, our hope is that with that and with the more staff on board, we can actually bring down the total time for making a decision, which we think is an important indicator. Through those improvements. We also have goals that go towards, it's predominantly to the performance on different kinds of applications that are in place.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the ranking member, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for questions.
Dr. Shuren, I wanted to ask about the 510K process and first commend you for the focus you've given to improving it. I've been interested in that, how to fix it for a long time. In fact, when I was the chairman of the subcommittee, we held a hearing in 2009. Quite frankly, both before and after that hearing, I was of the opinion that 510K process was broken. So I'm glad that FDA has focused its attention on resources and how to improve it. I've seen your 510K action plan, and the amount of work that CDRH did on this topic is pretty impressive. What's your sense of the 510K program now? Is it operating better? Is there more predictability and consistency? And what steps on your action plan would you categorize as game changers?
So the program is not where we'd like it to be. We're not seeing the performance from it that we would like to have, but we are starting to see some early indicators, if you will, the canaries in the coal mine, suggesting instead of them dying from gas, that actually they're doing better. So starting almost 10 years ago, we saw the requests for additional information on 510Ks go up and up and up steadily. We saw total review times going up and up and up. We saw the backlog of 510Ks going up, and we saw the percent of 510Ks being cleared going down. In 2011, for the very first time, we're seeing the percent of additional requests on 510Ks starting to dip for the first time the other direction. We're seeing that the percent of 510Ks being cleared has been going up. I put all this information, by the way, in my written testimony. 2012, that number, that percent of clearance actually went up beyond 2011. We're seeing the backlog go down. So all of these are early signs, but I don't think you're going to see the real benefit from it until many of our policies go into effect. Game changers right now, simple, smart business process improvements to assure that critical decisions like asking for additional information are not made in the lowest parts of our center, but they're made at the right level in management, which is why I need enough managers to provide that oversight. In fact, we created a Center Science Council of our most senior people to oversee the most important decisions. We're putting in new policies to incentivize starting clinical trials in the U.S. earlier. If you get the clinical studies started here first, you keep the technology here because the companies come back to the same doctors over and over again, and also having a benefit-risk framework that is much more focused on taking into account what patients are willing to tolerate for risk, because they're the ones who get the devices, not my reviewers.
Thank you. Let me ask you about the conflict of interest in these scientific, the scientific experts for the advisory panels. We've heard from a number of parties that the conflict of interest provisions are not working and are excluding legitimate experts. When the commissioner was here 2 weeks ago, she indicated that there have been challenges at FDA in filling the advisory panels. Would you agree that CDRH is having similar challenges?
We do face challenges moving forward, which is why we agree with you. You consider this an important issue. We consider this an important issue. And although we have not found a legislative fix yet that has a significant difference, we think this is something worth exploring. And one of the reasons I would like to take the chairman up on his offer to work on legislation, focus on this area as one of those areas. We're also looking at internal process changes. Are there other things we can be doing to sort of reduce those challenges we face?
I know when you testified before the Senate Help Committee in November, you indicated willingness to engage with the senators, so I guess I'm getting the same assurance from you today on that. All right. Chairman Pitts talked about the UDI, and I think it's unfortunate that after 5 years, I think we should be closer on implementation of what I consider a very, very critical component. But what I wanted to ask you is, could you explain how UDI will interact with other post-market authorities that FDA has in the device space and other initiatives that you have underway?
So a unique device identifier will allow us to link the use of a device with a patient's experience with the device. So data is collected every day as a part of routine clinical practice, and we can't tap into that without a UDI. That's why the unique device identifier is a game changer. And it will allow us to move forward to have more robust post-market surveillance systems that then industry and we can take advantage of, and health practitioners and others, in the following ways. If we have more robust post-market surveillance, one, when there are problems, if we can identify them more quickly and get on top of them, doesn't mean the device comes off the market. It means we address it, and you don't get the front page stories in the newspapers because you don't have so many people exposed. You have a better infrastructure that allows companies to conduct post-market studies at lower cost, because the infrastructure is there. And it will allow us to make better use of post-market data to reduce the burden for pre-market data requirements for some devices. In fact, if we're properly authorized, we may be able to even shift some of the pre-market data requirements to the post-market setting. But these are all things we could do in the future, and a unique device identifier is critical to making that happen.
Thank you.
Chair thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the Vice Chairman of the committee, Dr. Burgess, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Shuren, the committee, we've worked on this a lot over the years, and I'm just like Mr. Barton. It just doesn't seem like there's a repetitive stream of people into my office talking about difficulties they're having in this arena. So I don't think there's any question that we have a problem. The problem generally seems to be with predictability and consistency at your agency. And whether we all agree with where the problems are and whether we all agree with how much activity is leaving our shores, I don't think there's any question that some is. And the President's own Jobs Council has raised this issue, and specifically they commented, quoting from them, "Our medical innovation system is in jeopardy. Investment in the life sciences area is declining at an alarming rate because of the escalating cost, time, and risk of developing new drugs and devices. While many factors contribute to the decline, an important factor is the uncertainty surrounding the FDA regulatory environment." So the President, this is not House Republicans, this is the President's Jobs Council. This is the administration that is voicing concern with the predictability and consistency within the FDA. How do you respond to what the Jobs Council is telling us?
I think you can add me and my own staff who have our own concerns about the program as well. And I will say in terms of the Jobs Council, when they then came out and said what things you might want to look at for the medical device program, one of their recommendations was to have a benefit risk determination framework that's much more focused on looking at patient tolerance for risk. We appreciate that because when they came out with that recommendation, we had actually already proposed such a framework over the summer. In fact, we are finalizing it right now, and we have committed and are already set to put out the final document and implement it come the end of March.
But again, I just can't stress this enough. There is a steady stream of people that come in to see me, and I suspect other members of Congress have similar stories, where there is a problem, and the problem seems to be centered at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. It is clearly something that needs your highest attention, and look forward not just to your framework, but we actually look forward to some performance on this. And as I referenced in the opening statement, we can't just be upping the dollars and decreasing the performance. And unfortunately, that seems to be the direction we're going. Let me ask you a couple of specifics on some of the things I referenced. Some of the draft guidance that is coming out of your area where it appears that you're increasing your jurisdiction and your territory. And I'm not sure that's in everyone's best interest and specifically in your best interest. But what about the draft guidance for industry and staff on the in vitro diagnostic products that are labeled for research use only and investigational use only? This is something that came out of your office, and depending upon the stage of development, such components are officially labeled research use only, or investigational use only. That means they're neither sold nor marketed as clinical devices, nor offered as services such as laboratory developed tests, but they may be useful in developing new devices. So now it looks like your agency is wanting to regulate even the devices that are used to help develop the devices. Have I read that correctly?
Well, components that are being used as a part of a device are part of the device, and we regulate that. You know, the policy we
Well,
put
let me
out
ask you
there-
this then. Specifically, what are some of the deficiencies that you saw that required you to issue this draft guidance?
that there were companies who are actually saying that this particular device or analyte was for research purposes. They were actually marketing it for commercial use. So this policy is to clarify in terms of what you need to do to be very clear of, is this truly for research and how you handle that, or is this actually being used in patient care? And that's what it's trying to clarify.
And how, again, give us an idea of the scope of the problem of this. Is this something that you're bumping up against all the time, or is this something that has happened and you're trying to get in front of it?
No, it's something we have been running into and we continue to see, and that's why we have a policy to clarify it.
And can you provide us on the committee with some examples of that so we could better understand why this jurisdictional, why this mission creep is going on at your center?
We would be happy to come back and give you some very specific, give you a list of examples.
And once again, it just doesn't seem to be the flexibility built into this. It's kind of an all or nothing phenomenon. And one of the complaints we get is there is no flexibility within the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Is that something that you can help us with?
First of all, I would say actually we're more flexible than people give us credit for. But we
Okay,
do
fair
have-
statement,
I mean,
because you're
so-
not getting any credit at all right now.
Well, I know. I mean, I'll give you an example. We just, recently improved, a device for tears in the large artery in the chest. In terms of flexibility, we actually approved that device based upon just 51 patients followed for just 30 days. Very small, not randomized, no control arm, and we did it in less than 180 days. So the opportunities are there. The changes we're trying to make in the program is also to ensure we have flexibility where we need to do it, but we're also consistent in how we apply it. And like I said, we made some process improvements that just went in the end of last year. There are a lot of policy changes, good policy changes, but as you know, as a federal government agency, we have to get public comment. That's a good thing. We get lots of perspectives. The downside is it takes more time. So most of the things we're trying to improve actually don't start getting finalized and kicking in until this year.
We want you to be consistent. That's part of our goal as well. But I would appreciate you providing us some data on this, because some of the stuff we're hearing does not comport with what you're telling us. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back. Maybe we'll have time for a second round.
Chair recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Shuren, one of the bills included in the Republican package would make significant changes to the Device Center's so-called third-party review program. Currently, that program permits third parties to review certain 510K applications and provide recommendations to FDA on whether the agency should clear a particular device. Then FDA has 30 days to make a final decision. That's what the law is now. The Republican bill would alter this scheme to make the third party's recommendation binding on FDA if FDA fails to respond in 30 days. The bill also would expand the types of devices that these third parties are permitted to review to include permanently implantable or life-sustaining or supporting devices. These outside reviewers are not currently allowed to review these devices. I think these changes are very worrisome. Would FDA be concerned about these kinds of changes to the program?
We are deeply concerned about these changes. I mean, the hard stop, the default about their decision going to effect if we don't make a decision actually can have the perverse impact also of our being in a position to actually not approve that product. That actually can spell the death knell for the third-party review program. And I don't think that was really the intent behind the bill, but that's probably the outcome. That's a good outcome that will likely happen. Expanding the scope of the devices, I'll tell you, there are over 1,000 devices that are already eligible for third-party review. I mean, for 510K, most of the 510Ks would be eligible. We've gone through the different categories, and we've said almost like 75%, the number may in fact be higher, could then be eligible of that set for third-party review. The problem is that program hasn't worked all too well, and one of the big challenges we face is that those third parties don't have access to the confidential information that we do. So as a result, they end up coming back sometimes with decisions that are not fully informed. For example, we may have already spoken to a company about what they need to do. They came to us, and then they go separately to a third party. They have no idea what that conversation was. And as a result, they can't take advantage of it. That's a challenge we really face in getting that program back.
Well, I was
to speed.
concerned about this program when we implemented it in 1997. I was never comfortable with the concept of having external third parties who have the potential for conflicts of interest on their own reviewing these important devices. So when I read this bill, I was very worried about the changes that they would put in place. After hearing your further description of the impact it would have, it makes me even more concerned, and I feel very uncomfortable with these further changes. It's like the XL pipeline resolution. You force a decision, you get a bad decision. Another of the Republican slate of bills, the Pre-Market Predictability Act of 2011, would make certain changes to three key areas of FDA's device regulation. One, to FDA's oversight of the investigational device exemption. Two, to the so-called least burdensome provisions. And three, to the procedures for appealing decisions through the Centers for Devices. I want to start with the changes to the least burdensome provision because those are the most troubling to me. This language was added to FDA's statute as part of the 97 Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act at a time when the industry was asserting that FDA was requiring too much of device manufacturers and stifling innovation, strikingly similar to what we hear still today. And in essence, these provisions say that FDA must consider the least burdensome means of demonstrating that a device is effective when the agency makes its approval or clearance decisions. So in other words, FDA should consider whether clinical data are necessary if there are other less burdensome means for demonstrating that a device can be marketed. The Pre-Market Predictability Act would change this provision by adding more specific language, like requiring FDA to consider alternative approaches to clinical data in evaluating device effectiveness, quote, in order to reduce the time, effort, and cost, end quote, and directs FDA to consider, quote, alternatives to randomized, controlled clinical trials and the use of surrogate endpoints, end quote, when clinical data are necessary. This seems to me overly prescriptive. Why would Congress be dictating to our premier scientific regulatory body what type of clinical data it should consider? It's also concerning because it seems that it could make it harder for FDA to require clinical data even when the agency believes it is necessary. I know that some of the language in this bill was lifted from FDA's 2002 guidance implementing the least burdensome provision, but it looks like there were some changes to that language that could be significant. Can you comment on this?
Yes. First, let me say I support the least burdensome principle. I think as a general matter, it's good government, and I support the policy we put back in our guidance in 2002. It's why I reemphasized it to my staff last year in email. It's why we're actually tailoring our guidances so we apply it specifically to specific devices. I do have concerns regarding this legislation because as it's drafted, we are reading it as lowering the standards in the U.S. for devices coming on the market, and that concerns us. And also, to the extent there's a difference in that language in the bill versus our guidance, we have to reconcile those differences, which means we have to change the current policy. If folks think we have the right policy but we're not applying it consistently, that's a different issue. Now, we do have concerns about not applying it consistently, and that's why we put in process improvements to assure that we're getting the right level of sign-off on any decisions for actually trying to ask for more information or doing something different than we did before, and oversight on decisions to make sure we are applying the least burdensome principle. That's the problem we think needs to be fixed, and that's the one we're already working on.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the Chair Emeritus of the committee, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's better to have a third-party review than to have it sit on a bureaucrat's desk at the FDA and not get reviewed at all, but that's just me. Mr. Chairman, I want to put into record a study of October 2011 by the National Venture Capital Association and the Medical Innovation and Competitive Coalition. I'm going to put the entire study in the record, but I want to just give some of the bullet points. This study was done in October of last year, and its conclusion summary is that venture capital companies in the United States are decreasing their investment in biotechnology and medical device startups in the United States. They're reducing their concentration in critical therapeutic areas, and they're shifting their focus away from the United States towards Europe and Asia. The primary reason is because of FDA regulatory challenges. In the last 3 years, they've decreased by 40% their investments in medical devices. In the next 3 years, they expect to decrease it again by 42%, and 61% of the respondents cited as their primary reason regulatory challenges at the FDA. I'm sure that you've seen this study, or at least the summaries of it, Doctor?
Yes, I've seen it.
Okay. Now, the proposal that the industry and your department have agreed to doubles the user fees per year for the next, I think, 4 or 5 years. The current PMA fee right now, I believe, is $220,000. Is that correct?
That's correct. For full fee, if you're a small business, it's $55,000.
Okay. What does it go to in this proposal that we've yet to see?
So we're finalizing those details, but we're thinking at the end of 5 years it would be about $268,000, so go up by about $48,000. And it was actually a little bit higher last year. We reduced it because by law, if we collected a little bit more money, we had to reduce the fees, so we reduced the fees this year.
And what does the small company fee go up to?
I think it's about $67,000.
And what is the level at which you're eligible for the small company fee?
If your annual sales or receipts are $100 million or less.
100 million or less. And is that what it is in the current? So that is that changed or unchanged?
No, that's remained the same. And you can compare this on the drug side. So that's the PMA. The NDA is the complement on the drug side. That fee is $1.8 million.
Okay. Now, I'm sure, Doctor, that you're aware that in the new health care law that passed several years ago, there's a 2.3% tax on medical device companies, and it's expected to raise $20 billion over the next 10 years.
I am aware of the tax.
Why could we not use some of that money and have no fee increase at all?
The tax isn't under our purview. That's a question for the administration. But I will say the concern about dollars, and I recognize, for industry to ask them to pay more, they're figuring out how to do that. But I will tell you, $595 million over 5 years. Compared to what you heard the other week on the Generic Drug User Fee Act, over 5 years, they're going to collect about $1.5 billion. And the Prescription Drug User Fee Act over 5 years is going to collect almost $3.5 billion. So I appreciate the industry paying more, and they made compromises, we made compromises to get to where we are. But to look at us and say that we're, asking for way too much, the drug program is going to get 6 times the amount in user fees over 5 years than us. Even generic drugs, a smaller program, is going to get 3 times, almost 3 times the amount.
I appreciate that, but your current medical fee is $287 million, and under this proposal, it doubles.
Well, not the individual fees to company, the collections. Things like most of the small companies make the 510K devices, and the fee right now is about $2,000, and under the changes being made over 5 years, it would go up to about $2,600. They also pay a registration fee, and many of them have one facility. That right now is about $2,300, and it might go up to $3,800. If you look at the drug side, a registration fee for a facility is a little over $500,000.
My time's expiring, Mr. Chairman, but putting me down is very skeptical. I will look at this with an open mind, but if I had to vote today, I would vote no, and I would really ask the committee staff on both sides to, once we get the proposal, to really scrub it, and let's make sure that we protect our our device user companies and the consumers are going to have to ultimately pay the increase in these fees. That I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and if you'll provide a copy of that study for the minority, they'd like to see it before we enter it in the record. Thank you. Chair recognizes the Ranking Member Emeritus, Mr. Dingell, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Shuren, I want your assurances that nowhere in the legislation is any money being diverted from the clearance of devices or pharmaceuticals. Is there any diversion of them, of the fees to be collected under this legislation from the actual clearance into any other programs at FDA? Yes or no?
No.
Okay, thank you. Now, do the agreed upon user fees give FDA resources necessary to ensure safety and efficacy of medical devices? Yes or no?
Yes.
Insufficient staffing at FDA and high employee turnover rates were mentioned by you, and they're a matter of concern. Will the agreed upon user fees allow FDA to hire staff to carry out functions necessary to protect patient safety and improve new innovative devices? Yes or no?
Yes.
Will agreement allow FDA to improve training of staff to ensure consistency in the review process? Yes or no?
Yes.
Do you believe the additional staff and professional development will help lead to reduced employee turnover? Yes or no?
Yes.
This authorization of medical device user fees includes several accountability provisions. The independent assessment of the review process is one of these provisions. Do you believe that this independent evaluation of the device review process and the recommendations from this evaluation will help FDA to identify needed areas of improvement? Yes or no?
Yes.
And will you put effort into seeing to it that that transpires?
Yes.
Now, will the independent assessment help industry and FDA to evaluate how FDA is using these resources from the user fee program? Yes or no?
Yes.
Dr. Shuren, would you agree that user fees are necessary to supplement the rather miserable level of appropriations provided by Congress to FDA for the purposes in the legislation?
Yes.
Now, Doctor, I have a concern here. If a high-risk device was put on the market with no trials for efficacy whatsoever, let's say a pacemaker or a heart valve, do you believe that a provider would reasonably know when or under what conditions to prescribe the particular pacemaker to an individual?
No.
So we have a real problem. If we don't assure that these things are safe, we might be putting in a hip or a knee or a heart valve or a pacemaker that wouldn't work. And then we'd have a fine mess on our hands, would we not?
Yes.
All right. Now, again, if a high-risk device was put on the market with no trials for efficacy, do you believe a patient would be sure of the efficacy of the particular or specific pacemaker for their particular heart condition? Yes or no?
No.
If a high-risk device was put on the market with no trials for efficacy, can a patient or provider know that the device is efficacious for the heart conditions you are trying to treat? Yes or no?
No.
In my opinion, demonstrating efficiency and efficacy in post-market trials as opposed to pre-market approval would weaken the high standard that patients have come to expect. Do you agree, yes or no?
Yes.
Now, even industry associations have made it clear that they support the regulatory framework currently in effect at FDA. Do you agree that maintaining this framework will preserve America's leadership in medical device innovation, yes or no?
Yes.
We're not going to be benefited by approving devices that are not efficacious and that don't help the patient, are we?
No.
That's going to have a bad effect on our sales of devices, is it not?
Yes.
Now, I want to go back to a little bit of history on this. This whole business started when I was chairman of the committee and chairman of oversight. We found that there was a massive amount of abuse at FDA, that there were gratuities taken and all manner of difficulties. We found that a lot of this was judgments that were being abused by FDA because they didn't have the money to do the job. And we found that industry had this awful problem of not being able to get clearance. So we found in the case of pharmaceuticals that pharmaceuticals were laying around and not getting approved. And sometimes on a 17-year patent, it was taking 7 to 10 years to get that done. A major U.S. pharmaceutical company would lose during that time $250 million a year. The consequences of that were very serious. So the Congress was always plagued with legitimate demands by industry to give them an extension of the patent. And I supported many of these things simply because it was basic fairness. But we figured out that the only way to do this was to see to it that they got their clearance quickly. So with the agreement of the industry, the first thing we did was to move this into the pharmaceuticals. And then we had the over-the-counters came in and said, you know, it'd be a good idea if you did this for us because it would help us. And then we found that others would agree to it, although I have to say the device manufacturers had some difficulty in swallowing it, but they ultimately did. And they found it worked, and they found that they all made more money because they were getting their patents cleared in a faster and a better fashion. I hope my colleagues will learn a little bit about that history. This gives cleaner and better service to the people. It saves money, it helps innovation, and it helps our manufacturers to make a decent money out of their patents without the delay that was occurring previous to these events. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Shuren, for being here. Do you agree that the Institute of Medicine study on the 510K process was widely rejected, yes or no?
One of their recommendations was widely rejected.
So that'd be a yes.
Partial yes. They had
Okay,
8
I'll take partial. I'm gonna.
Give you a partial.
I'm a la Mr. Dingell's standards here. So that's right. I think I need a few more years on me. How much did we pay? How much did you pay for that study?
About $1.3 million.
Did you ask for your money back? I'm glad we got some giggling. The reality is, I was at a breakfast this morning and someone was asking for additional federal money at only $20 million. The reality is, you're sitting here saying we don't have enough money, but then we fund a study to the Institute of Medicine that costs $1.3 million that's widely rejected, and we don't get our money back. So these dollars all add up. And we're in a Congress now that says, you know, this whole saying, if you worry about the pennies, the dollars take care of themselves. So as we're talking about Mr. Barton, why is he doubling a user fee? Well, if we take care of the pennies, the dollars will take care of themselves. And in this case, I don't think we got our money's worth out of the Institute of Medicine's report.
And I'll say I appreciate those concerns. They actually had a number of other recommendations that we are following up on, and if it is of interest to the committee, and I don't want to eat up your time, I would be happy at whenever it's convenient now or set a separate time to walk through what we will be doing with the Institute of Medicine recommendations in their report and the ones that we deferred a decision on, to give them an opportunity to weigh in. So there are about 15
Okay,
of them.
right, and I appreciate that, and obviously we're not pleased with the response so far. Tell me, again, this is, we'll go to the yes or no format. Is it important that we require reviewers to prove scientific or regulatory rationale for major decision-making?
There needs to be a scientific rationale.
Is that a yes? Come on, you can do it for Mr. Dingell. Why can't you say yes or no? Maybe because he's maybe on the other side of the aisle. I mean, this is a pretty simple.
I would suggest if the gentleman does need help, I'll be glad to assist him.
You want to read these for me?
Then let me say with the caveat within those constructs to the question, but some of the wording I might have put differently so that the wrong meaning isn't conveyed to the committee. But if I have
Maybe I should
choice-
share my questions with you prior to the hearing as other folks do to get a clarification of that in the question and answering. Do you think it's important we establish an expedited appeals process for any challenges to those decisions?
Yes.
Thank you. Do you think it's important to have qualified trained reviewers handling applications for submissions?
Yes.
Do you think it is important that we have FDA published detailed review summaries of 510K clearance, pre-market approval, and HDE and de novo?
yes with caveat. I mean, all of the.
We're getting there. All
But
right.
some of these go to legislation that, quite
Amen,
frankly,
brother.
I
That's what
know
we're
that-
talking about.
That would actually,
And, you know, and legislation that
no-
was lampooned by the ranking member of the full committee, the full committee here. I mean, he specifically took crosshairs on legislation, putting in its worst light, where, based upon some of your answers, maybe some of those have some merit.
Yeah.
And that's what we do. I mean, that's what a hearing's about. Is
I know, and we'd
is-
like to work through those, but some of those things in the bills, and even things like detailed decision summaries, if you're talking about summaries that we are doing as opposed to what we're doing now, those have cost to them. They will divert and could
Well, we're
divert
seeing we've got a
resources from
Obamacare $1
implementing-
billion of tax increases now and fee increases. So we're not sure it's all about money. We've seen that the medical device folks are really ponying up a lot of money now. They're doing it in the Obamacare tax, and they're doing it with this agreement. Let me go to a final point. FDA leadership explicitly, you kind of mentioned this earlier, but I wanted to follow up. FDA leadership explicitly directed staff in a memo dated November 23rd, 2008 to remove the quote-unquote least burdensome language from guidance documents. And of course, we have the, you know, pieces of the legislation here that says the importance of the least burdensome provision. What are you doing to make sure reviewers actually apply to the least burdensome standard in practice?
Yeah. So what we did is we took out, there was boilerplate that was inconsistently being used. It was creating more confusion and actually wasn't helping our staff apply least burdensome. So we're doing the following. First of all, you should also have, I communicated with my staff about how important it is to follow the least burdensome principle. That went out also as a subsequent email. Secondly, what we're doing is trying to apply the least burdensome principles to specific devices. So manufacturers don't just hear, well, you apply least burdensome, to show them, in fact, how it can be applied to their device. That's significantly more meaningful. We put in processes in place to try to assure we've got management input so that we are applying the least burdensome principle consistently in our decision-making. And I think those changes are starting to kick in the program. Those are meaningful, important changes to make.
Thank you, Dr. Sherman. Thank you, Chairman.
Chair thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much for your testimony, Dr. Shuren. I appreciate the work that has been done to reach the MDUFA deal, and I think it's important to, this is a very important moment to balance the needs of the companies for increased predictability at the agency, but also to increase patient safety. Congress needs to uphold our part of the deal. As far as I've mentioned, and as I have mentioned in previous hearings, these user fee agreements do not supplant Congress's role in ensuring that FDA has the necessary resources to do its job. I hope we can work together to ensure adequate appropriations for the agency. Before I begin with my questions, I want to quickly raise the issue of the unique identifier policy for medical devices that is currently stuck in OMB. No matter what one's position on the policy itself, everyone is stuck in a holding pattern until this is released. Getting this policy out of OMB is important for industry and consumers alike. And I want to put on the record that Representative Schakowsky and I have sent a letter to OMB urging them to move forward on releasing the policy on the unique device identifier system. I appreciate, Dr. Shuren, that FDA's work on the policy and look forward to its release. Now, shifting gears with my question, Dr. Shuren, reports by the Institute of Medicine and the GAO have expressed that women have been historically underrepresented in medical research, particularly so for cardiovascular and other device trials. But due to proprietary data issues, it's hard to know for sure what is and what is not getting reported to FDA. And that's why my bill, the Heart for Women Act, which has passed the House twice with near unanimous support, would require the GAO to examine whether clinical trial and drug and medical device safety and efficacy data are being reported by sex, by race, and by age. Perhaps we can make some headway here. I understand that as part of MDUFA's agreement, the FDA and industry members will conduct an initial meeting to set goals, timelines, and expectations. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you discuss to what extent the FDA will inquire about the device's use in a diverse population of patients? And if the device is intended to be used in a diverse patient population, could the FDA use this time to encourage enrollment of a representative group on clinical trials so that the trials fully represent and reflect the usage of the product and prevalence of the disease?
So we have been stepping up our efforts to have better representation in medical device clinical trials, and that's been through guidance, that's been through workshops, and that's been through one-on-one engagement with companies. So we believe it is important and it's something we are pursuing.
And it's something you can give measurable results on?
To look at what may be changing in terms of representation in clinical trials, yes, that kind of data we could be able to provide.
Would it be transparent enough for us to be able to see the data? Or at least to get the assurances that you're giving us that there is a level of understanding of, and that it is a fully representative sample?
Yeah, we will go back because we've been trying to be more transparent about information that we're using in our decisions, and we actually have a tool that puts up, starting to put up information on the clinical trials that are used in support of device approvals. And I think that is one of the components in there, but we can double check and get back on.
I would appreciate that we have some follow-up on this particular question and look forward to working with you on it. I want to bring up another topic in my remaining time. Several weeks ago, I asked your colleague, Dr. Hamburg, about the Sentinel system for post-market surveillance. The PDUFA agreement will allow user fees to go towards using Sentinel for post-market surveillance of prescription drugs, thereby protecting the public's health, saving money on research, and staying ahead of the curve on drug recalls. And from reports, most of the work Sentinel has done to date has been in the drug space. Now, let me ask you, can Sentinel be used in the medical device space?
It can be used. We've been a part of the discussions. The holdbacks right now is, one, we need unique device identifiers. Until we have that, we can't do it. The second is, I will say, when Congress put the mandate to have a program for drugs, that got a lot of people to step up to the plate to participate, and it's a very non-regulatory program. But because it's not mentioned specifically for devices, it's not had that same level of enthusiasm.
So those, I wanted to ask you to expand upon the barriers that might exist to expanding it to the device side, and you've kind of hinted. Would you go further in the remaining few seconds to talk about some ways that you see as barriers that perhaps then we could, somehow there could be a pathway through to making that be effective there?
Yeah, well, the unique device identifiers, we need to have that system in place. And I think the fact that the bill, the legislation that passed just mentioned drugs, put a lot of attention, and for the folks who have data, the focus went to drugs because devices wasn't.
Are you saying that legislation needs to be revisited that includes devices?
I think if legislation that mentioned devices, we would get more interest in having such a program for medical devices.
I yield back. Thank you.
Chair, thank the gentlelady, and recognize the gentleman, Mr. Rogers, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Shuren, for being here. You know, I can see how it gets confusing. This committee asked the FDA just a very short number of years ago to regulate tobacco, and they're going to generate some $2 billion over 5 years on a product that, if you use as directed, will kill you. I'd say it's fairly confusing messages to the FDA. So for that, I'm going to apologize for what Congress did to you. And I certainly could find lots of places for that $2 billion when it comes to medical research to do something pretty spectacular that will never find, it's certainly not going to find its way there. But I guess what it confuses me, and I too have been looking at the National Venture Capital Association, mainly because they're the canary in the coal mine. If they're the first ones to give an indication if, in fact, they're going to change their investment habits into companies who are innovating when it comes to medical devices. And the survey results are a bit frightening. So you believe that medical devices that are approved by the FDA, they advance American public health. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do agree.
And would you agree with Commissioner Hamburg that the FDA has a role to play in ensuring that medical device companies stay in the United States and want to bring their products to the market here first? There's some advantage to that, is there not?
Yes.
So, and I know we're saying to some degree nothing to see here, we're moving on, we're trying to get through this, and I hope that you do, but would you find it concerning that according to this survey that 44% of American venture capitalist firms are now going to invest in life science companies in Europe and Asia? I mean, it's clearly a shift. I mean, is that concerning to you?
Well, it does concern me to see investments not going into development of products here for the U.S. And I have to tell you, I've been on the record with that beforehand, and it's one of the drivers for some of the policies we have in place. We've been out meeting with the venture capital community. Ross Jaffe is going to be up here testifying. Ross and I have spoken on many occasions. And I'll tell you, and Ross can tell me if I'm not telling the truth, but you know, some of the top things of their concerns was, I mentioned that benefit risk determination, taking into account patient tolerance for risk, recognizing that when you have truly novel first-time technology that you can't expect it to be a home run, you got to view that a little bit differently. All of that is baked into this framework, a common framework between us and industry that is explicit, that will be a part of the record. A second is incentivizing getting the early clinical studies to start here in the U.S. And those policies were developed in part directly out of those concerns. The innovation pathway was features of that were things that the venture capital community had raised as could be helpful to them to help some of these breakthrough products get to market.
Great.
We have taken that deeply into
I'm just going to reclaim the time, and I appreciate those efforts, but what they're also saying is that the reason that investment shift is because, quote, the unpredictability at the FDA. So I understand you tried to make some changes. Did you hear that from those venture capital firms about the unpredictability of the FDA?
Yes, and that's why a number of the actions we're taking are meant to address predictability in terms of better guidance, better decision-making, in terms of better oversight on the decision-making that we put in place. For folks who may be interested, we did put out an overview that covers all the actions we're taking, and it puts a list of everything we're doing, and if we've achieved it, a link to all that information. I will make sure that our Office of Legislation, I think that's been passed out, will make sure that is sent to everyone, and when we and that is updated every time we take another action.
And I understand your concern. The one thing that worried me a little bit is you said you sent out an email to your staff on the less burdensome approach. Sorry, but that doesn't sound like a great plan to me. Sent a lot of emails, but
well, that's why we follow that up in terms of specifically addressing it in guidance.
But my point being here, Doctor, and I appreciate it. I hope you understand the gravity of it. And just putting out a report certainly hasn't deterred the long list of folks who come into Congress every day and saying they're having these huge problems. Investment is shifting overseas. The smaller folks are losing investment as we speak. And so we need a little fire in the belly here. If you're truly trying to change that equation, it has to happen now. We don't have time for reports and lighthearted emails about how we ought to change for the future. I appreciate you having to defend this, but at the same time, if we don't change it, we jeopardize having to have our devices manufactured and innovated in Asia and Europe. I don't think that's good for U.S. consumers. Oh, and by the way, we made it more difficult because we also applied a tax to the companies who were successful enough to get through what is a very unpredictable FDA process, which means they're also hiring less and innovating less. I mean, the policies here don't work together. And that's why I think people like me are very, very frustrated with the FDA, knowing that we've asked you to do some really dumb things in the past. But this stuff is so crucially important for our consumers and the folks who need these medical devices. We got to have a little urgency in our approach here, and I just don't see it.
Well, I would say actually we've had the urgency. You know, 2010, we went out and we went across the country to get input from industry, from others. We pushed very quickly to get out reports and recommendations. I will tell you, I got letters from some of your colleagues telling me to slow down. I heard from industry, folks, slow down, more time for conversation. And our feeling was, we can't wait. We know there are these issues, and that's why we moved forward. We put our plan in the beginning of 2011, and we've been marching relentlessly forward. I keep hearing from people, industry has even said, can you slow down? You're putting out too many stuff. And it's sort of, there's a lot of things that if we don't work them together and fix, rather than just a few little things, we won't have the impact we want to have. And that email I sent out is not so it's fluff. Quite frankly, leadership starts at the top. And to do that and communicate with my staff, I have to be out there. I have to be out in front. I got to put my name on it, and that's what that email did.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and recognize gentleman, Mr. Engel, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Doctor. Talking about medical advice devices, the 2011 Institute of Medicine's report on the FDA's 510K processes raised significant concerns about the current pre-market approval and post-market monitoring processes for these medical devices. We'd all agree, I don't think there'd be any disagreement on this, that there's a necessary balance between pre-market and post-market FDA processes. No matter how stringent the pre-market requirements, it's obviously not possible to know everything about the safety and effectiveness of new products until they've been in use for some significant period of time. And as we improve the processes for getting products to patients more quickly, I believe we need to improve FDA's ability to detect problems that occur once products are on the market. So let me ask you this. Can you please describe the role that post-market data collection and surveillance play in the current FDA device approval framework? And secondly, what additional authorities or resources does FDA need to address the problems highlighted in the IOM report?
Well, we do use information from the post-market setting to help inform on the pre-market side. Many of the devices that are made, they constantly come back in the door through incremental innovation. So having real-world experience on those devices is critically important. Our systems in the U.S. are pretty good. They're not where it's not really the system the nation deserves. We have adverse event reporting. It gives us some information, but we don't have a truly robust data collection that we really need. The Institute of Medicine highlighted that point, and we agree with them. We need to pursue that at a national level, and that's why, as a strategic priority, we put out last month, we said we will go forward and put out a draft national strategy for post-market surveillance in the spring. We will have a public meeting. We'll have a public dialogue how to do this, because ultimately this will help companies, can help companies keep products on the market, can help companies get products on the market, can also help protect patients. It's a win-win. We need to work together. And I think things like Sentinel, unique device identifier, are all critical aspects. Having more registries, we've been stepping up our efforts on registry. I will tell you, Europe has a lot of issues with the post-market side. One thing they sometimes will do a little bit better than us is having a national registry for certain devices. I'll give you an example. Just very recently, we work with the American College of Cardiology, the Society of Thoracic Surgeons, and with a company, Edwards Life Sciences, on a registry for heart valves that are being inserted through blood vessels, revolutionary technology. And this now will be a national registry, not only get information on that device, but subsequent devices that come forward, and you can actually do post-market studies buried within that registry, can reduce future costs for doing those kinds of examinations.
Thank you, Doctor. Let me ask you a question about the regulation of laboratory-developed tests. The FDA's oversight of medical tests, the LDDs, have become controversial of late. As I understand it, there are several issues at play here. Firstly, there are a variety of tests, everything from blood tests to genetic tests that can predict whether a patient would benefit from a particular therapy. Secondly, the FDA regulates the actual tests themselves, while CMS oversees the administration of these tests called CLIA, the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments. It's clear that the FDA has jurisdiction over these tests, but the agency has historically exercised enforcement discretion with respect to so many of them. But there are recent signs that the agency is going to begin regulating a subset of these tests again. The reason I ask that is because one of the Republican medical device bills, the Modernizing Laboratory Test Standards for Patients Act, which is H.R. 3207, I believe would make radical changes in this regulatory scheme. The bill would remove FDA from the picture entirely and give complete control of these tests to CMS. My understanding is that CMS does not believe this is a good approach. So let me say this. I'm very concerned about the direction of this bill. And by all accounts, these tests are at the cutting edge of new medical therapies, and to take the responsibility of ensuring that these tests are clinically effective away from the FDA, our premier scientific regulatory body, and give it to one that lacks entirely the scientific expertise, to me makes absolutely no sense. Do you have concerns about the approach towards laboratory-developed tests laid out in H.R. 3207?
We do have concerns about it, and we appreciate the fact that the bill recognizes the fact that finally laboratory-developed tests need to be regulated. The days of the Wild West need to stop. that CLIA is not adequate for the oversight of that. The law as it currently stands is not good enough, and the standard of analytical validity and clinical validity, the standard that FDA uses, that it is the right standard. The problem is it creates a duplicative federal bureaucracy at a much higher cost, grows government unnecessarily, and it maintains an unlevel playing field between traditional manufacturers and labs who make the exact same kind of test, and as a result, just continues to stifle innovation and can actually kill jobs on the flip side. And then it allows devices to come, those tests to come out on the market, and then for CMS to make a decision after it goes on the market. So you can have a bad test that's out there. And we've seen plenty of laboratory-developed tests, ones for diagnosing ovarian cancer, that have been inaccurate. So women are having their ovaries out and didn't need to, making decisions about treatment for breast cancer, treatment on chronic Lyme disease. I mean, tests for autism that are just wrong. And they need to be regulated, but they need to be regulated right. And CMS did say they're not the right place for it, they don't have the expertise, and the cost would be about at least $50 to $100 million a year, plus $20 million startup. For our framework, in the first few years, we're talking about a cost that's probably less than $3 million in fees to industry. So I don't know why we want a more costly, less effective kind of approach, and this duplicative oversight that actually would not help.
Thank you. I agree. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thanks, Dr. Shuren. Thanks. And we had a meeting in our office about this important issue. To me, I'm from a manufacturing background and big believer in making in the USA and remaking it in the USA, and have been concerned about some of companies making them in Europe because of the regulatory environment. We talked about that. The one thing that I actually have a bill on guidance documents, and a lot of companies like guidance documents because it gives some regulatory predictability. But some of the problems, I just want your process for reviewing internal guidance documents, because some companies have said that they've submitted according to a guidance document to say, well, that guidance document no longer reflects FDA thinking. And so what process do you review those? And because how can they submit to you if they, or to a dated guidance document? Just kind of talk about what you're doing with the guidance process to improve it.
Yeah, so with guidance documents, you can actually continue to submit comments about it after the comment period has closed. It's different from rulemaking, so that docket remains open, and we'll look to see if new comments come in. We made a concerted effort to improve our guidance development process. In fact, in 2011, our production of guidance documents improved by about 22% over 2010, and 2010 was better than 2009. But we've sort of squeezed the fruit and gotten maybe about as much juice as we can from the internal process improvements. And it's one of the reasons, as a part of the MDUFA 3 reauthorization agreement, we're getting a little bit of extra dollars, about 5 additional people, to help us for the oversight of guidances. What's critical is we need people who are more technical writers on guidances, so our experts who are doing reviews can provide their expertise but not write the documents themselves. That's what's going on now. And so they get diverted away from doing pre-market reviews. The little bit extra help will help us take some of that tension off, will also help us do a better job at looking at guidances that have already been put out to see if changes need to be made, and also to try to make sure that we are finalizing draft guidances more quickly.
Okay, and one other point I wanted to bring up. On page 7 in your testimony, it's a chart. It says about it from 2000 to 2011 has been increased additional requests, to additional information from 510K requests, whereas now it says in 2011 three-fourths of all 510Ks had additional information requests coming back. And one we had, I think yesterday, somebody met with my staff that said on day 89 they got an additional information request. And I think the implication is that companies aren't submitting the information that you need, therefore you're having to ask for more. And I'm a manufacturing person, quality engineer, so I used to be responsible for submitting our tool and dies once they came in, and we got paid based on them being approved. And let me tell you, they were only wrong if I didn't have the right information, because I had to answer to somebody because literally once our customers signed off on that, they were by contract supposed to cut a check. So sometimes I felt delayed because it was the other parts of the projects weren't ready, and if it was able to keep this forward. So the question is, do you see the trend of it? Are three-fourths of the applications really inadequate? Or are you not letting them know what you need? I mean, that's the question that I have. Because it does seem like a disturbing trend to go from a third to three-fourths in 10 years.
Yes, and actually, because it was a disturbing trend, we did an analysis of 510K decisions. The first, I think, 130 we had done, or 110 in 2010, and we put that analysis on a website, and it's a mixed bag. I mean, there are times...
You have been willing to show that. I appreciate
Yeah.
these charts because it does show the issue, so I appreciate that. But go
Yeah,
ahead.
but it also shows the problems have been long-standing. I mean, this is like a decade of, and this was a canary in the coal mine that then led to increased total times for review. The data just marches up starting around 2002. When we looked at it, so a number of different reasons behind it. There are companies who we have put out very clear guidance on what to do, and they opted not to follow it, and they could do something different, but they didn't even justify doing different. I mean, even where for years, you provide a little bit of clinical data. If you want to measure oxygen through the skin, you take a blood sample and compare it. Company comes in, never even did the blood samples. We go back, do the blood samples. I mean, we've been doing this
that's
for years.
legitimate. That's
But
absolutely
those
legitimate. It's
things-
just hard to believe companies whose pay or their product are based on that are that.
Believe it or not,
effective.
it happens. But then we have companies where if we had better clarity on what to do, that would help. And the last is there are times where we ask for things that we shouldn't be asking for. And that was one of the drivers behind our changing our decision-making within the center, making sure we have that level of oversight, that the staff can't suddenly decide to ask for something extra until you have the proper level of sign-off. In fact, if you want to ask for new kind of clinical study across a type of device, that's made at the highest levels in the center by the Center Science Council, where those kinds of decisions in fact, should be made.
Yeah,
I just
about
need
10
enough
seconds.
managers to
Yeah.
provide that
I
oversight.
got about 10, and what Congressman Rogers said, I have a chart here from the venture capitalists, like 38% of their decisions, FDA regulations are about 38% of their decision whether to invest. And about 2 flights down, there's a meeting now, and I'm going to run back to on manufacturing. And so we've talked about that. That's a concern. That's why we're here and why we're real concerned about it, because we want it made in America and made safely and securely and efficiently. Appreciate your efforts. Thanks.
Chair, thanks. Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've heard a lot today from many that the FDA has become too risk-averse in terms of what the agency requires device manufacturers to do in order to obtain FDA clearance or approval. And we've heard that the FDA is insisting on too much clinical data prior to approval, and that this has resulted in a decrease in venture capital investment, as well as an export of innovation and jobs abroad. And to help address the situation, some have suggested that the FDA's mission statement should be changed to include things like job creation and innovation. And a bill has been introduced that would accomplish this. But even if we assume there is some truth to these reports, and I think there is a lot of evidence to suggest that in fact there is not, revising FDA's mission statement seems drastic to me. So I wanted you to comment on the implications of revising the FDA's mission statement to include things like job creation.
Well, we are concerned about a change to the mission statement that would include job creation, economic growth, competitiveness, because we read that, so are we looking at job growth in the context of product approvals? Are we now going to, to do that, then we're asking for financial data on the companies, we're looking at reimbursement opportunities, market analyses become part of approval decisions, and then whose jobs? Jobs in the U.S., or jobs overseas? What about jobs of the competitors? The devices most at risk will actually be the most disruptive technologies because they're more likely to adversely affect the competitors in the short term and could hurt job growth in that direction. So those are the kinds of, I really think, unintended consequences happen with those changes. And there are a number of other things in this bill as you march down the list that would lead to, we think, very troublesome changes in what we do. It can change the standard for evidence for our product approval decisions. One of them is on public participation. Read that and say, okay, so we're talking now about finally public participation in product approval decisions. And that means, so should we revisit what information we've considered confidential and start making more of that information public? And some people may think it's a good thing. We hear from industry, please don't do that. But that's where this bill is actually directing us. It talks about using the most innovative tools. Well, innovative doesn't mean it's the best tool. So we start using bad tools. And we talk about, well, make sure you're using just modern tools. Well, sometimes the newest tools aren't the best ones. Old ones are just as good, but why should we change the goalposts on industry every time there's some new modern tool? may not be necessary to do that.
So you think that this could slow down, complicate, and actually make less efficient the process?
Oh, yes, I think it could lead to some fairly dramatic changes in how we make product approval decisions that I think would adversely affect industry and adversely affect patients.
If you look at the language of the bill, and that's called the Food and Drug Administration Mission Reform Act, there is some language that may on its face seem less controversial, like changing the mission to require FDA to take into account the risks that certain patients are willing to take. Am I correct in saying that these are things the FDA is already doing? And if so, proponents of the bill would argue that there should be no harm in revising the mission statement to encompass things like things that the FDA is already doing. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yes, this is something we already are doing as part of the benefit risk determination framework we put out. That's already out there publicly, and it will go final and begin implementation at the end of March. That is going to happen. But this is an activity. It's not really a mission. And so this isn't exactly the right way of sending a message about having a benefit risk determination framework, because it's really an activity. It's an action.
Well, I'm concerned about revising FDA's mission statement. I think it's, again, a pretty drastic step, and it doesn't seem that there is a record for why such a dramatic change would, in fact, be necessary. So I thank you for your comments, and I yield back. Thank you.
Chair thanks, gentlelady, and recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Cassidy, for 5 minutes for questions.
Dr. Shuren. A friend of mine, an orthopedist, I'm a doctor, went to a conference in San Francisco and said he was struck that there was, relative to previous years, a paucity of new equipment being displayed. So what I'm speaking of is somewhat influenced by the conversation I had with him. I assume there must be some difference in terms of how you regard the bigger manufacturer or the bigger innovative company versus the smaller. Fair statement?
Yes, actually, we try to do a lot more hand-holding with the smaller companies. That's right.
What in this bill, I mean, if I were to go and say to those smaller companies, first, how do you define a small company? And secondly, if I were to go to those innovators and say, these are the specific provisions that pertain to you, what would be your summary?
So small businesses, for purposes of the User Fee Act, is $100 million or less in annual sales or receipt.
I want to have such a small business, by the way, but continue.
No. And what we will do is actually work with them in terms of what they may need to do to bring a product to market. We're very used to dealing with small companies because they make up the largest segment of the device industry, although most of the devices on the market are made by big companies. But I will tell you, one of the challenges we're seeing is some of the data is suggesting we're seeing an uptick of some of the first-time sponsors, companies coming to us. And because they're small companies, they oftentimes don't have a good understanding of what they need to do to come to market. I quite frankly think...
But that suggests a regulatory complexity as much as anything, correct?
No, you come to it with what you know, and for people who understand that system can work a lot better. I think you don't suddenly lower. You need to have efficient systems. You need to have clear systems. They need to be predictable and consistent. But you don't just suddenly lower the bar simply because someone says, I don't get it.
That's a fair statement. Are your fees the same for a larger and smaller company?
No, they're smaller for smaller companies.
And do they remain constant relative to the previous authorization, or do they increase or decrease for smaller companies in this? So
in MDUFA 3, they'll go up, and what we're talking about now is for PMA, going from about $55,000 now to $67,000 by 2017, and the first PMA for a small business is free. It's on the house.
Now, I presume that if you have a small company, you would still be required for, say, the double-blind controlled trial, insofar as that is practical, to test your invasive device. I assume that's the case.
The evidence you have to provide wouldn't change. I mean, the device is the device. It shouldn't change based upon who made it. That's been one of the issues with laboratory-developed tests.
That's a fair statement.
But at the same token, we're trying to apply least burdensome. So actually, most of our clinical trials are not placebo-controlled double-blind clinical trials. They're either not practical or they may not be necessary.
Now, let me ask you, as regards the increased revenue y'all are requesting. I've again seen stuff, and I've learned here to say what I've been told, not what I know. Let me first say that. But you, in your testimony, can see that there is an increased time for approval over the last several years. You're working to address that.
Yes.
But I've also seen that your revenue actually increased under the last MDUFA authorization. Your revenue significantly increased. And I think I know that your number of employees similarly increased. And so it seems like the lack of resources was not there. I mean, you had the resources. You had more money, you had more people, and yet the time to approval increased. So since we're being asked to give you more resources, why did more resources not work last time, but they are going to work this time?
Yeah. So two parts to that. One, there are program issues that need to get fixed, and those are things we have identified and we're fixing, and that is separate from resources if you're going to make it work. But the second is the resources we got weren't sufficient for the work we had to do. And one of the things in MDUFA 2 was we didn't take into account the increase in workload that would occur. So we got more people to try to meet the goals, but then the workload was also going up and sort of outpaced the resources we got. And we never addressed the fundamental issue of having enough people to do the work and enough managers to provide oversight. And so we constantly have this high turnover rate, which industry has complained about because it disrupts the review of the device.
You have a high turnover rate, but you did increase your number of employees. So what you're saying is you just needed to increase them even more.
That's correct. And we had the same problem, by the way, in the drug program about a decade ago. They had the same high turnover rates, same issues. Drug industry said, you know, and they were not concerned about, they were very concerned about performance. And so what happened was there were process improvements in the drug program, and they got more money. They were able to get over that hump, and they were able to put the drug program on the right trajectory. So you feel like your
process improvements are not enough just to use your existing employees with existing revenue more efficiently, but rather you need both efficiency and much more money?
That's correct.
I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes the gentleman, Mr. Matheson, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Dr. Shern, for being here today. I am glad that Mr. Barton and Mr. Rogers both made reference to the Venture Capital Association study. I was going to note that, but I think they've covered what the substance is the troubling trend of investment going offshore. I have grave concern about it for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, I want folks in the U.S. to have access to the best devices possible to maintain their health and safety, number one. And secondly, the medical device industry is the great U.S. success story over time, and it has got tremendous presence throughout the country, including in my home state of Utah, and I'm worried about investment shifting offshore. I do applaud your goal that you stated of bringing greater consistency and efficiency and transparency to the Device Center. And I want to ask you about your proposed guidance document on when device modification requires a 510K. Last year, as you know, FDA released its draft guidance to industry detailing when a manufacturer would need to submit a new 510K for a change to an existing device. Obviously, FDA's had a policy in the books for many years that the industry understood and was well accepted, but the new policy could, from what I've been told, dramatically increase FDA's workload by estimates of 200 to 500%, meaning that many more applications coming to the FDA for 510K. Is it your interpretation of that of the guidance document that it would require manufacturers to file 510Ks in that much of an increased magnitude in terms of workload within the FDA?
It's not, and we had put out the guidance actually to clarify when to submit a modification, predominantly in areas that were gray where we didn't provide clarity in the past. And we were not intending to raise the bar, but to clarify, to make it easier. We recognize, though, the concerns that have been raised by industry. We take them seriously, and I'll tell you, we've had companies in, we've had trade associations in, and we're actually working very closely with them, sort of marching through to see what would be the real impact. Did we get some things wrong? Did we not clarify properly? And we're going through that. We're doing that very methodically. You know, one of the downsides is one of the bills on guidance document development would actually limit the time frame to get a final guidance out. And if that was in effect and we had just the 1 year to do it, I'd be in a position to take that guidance and rush to finish it, whereas I'd rather take the time and work with industry to get it right. I think that's ultimately the right thing to do, and that's what we're trying to do now.
Let me ask you a specific component of the guidance. Is it your interpretation that the new guidance would require manufacturers to file a 510K when a manufacturer would need to change suppliers due to a supplier goes bankrupt or there's a fire or some other emergency? Would they need to, just by change of one of their suppliers, need to file a new 510K with the agency?
Just to change in supplier, no. They'd have to document it as part of their design controls. That's just internal records, but they don't have to submit a 510K.
It's my understanding that the guidance proposed last year would require manufacturers to file 510Ks for likely uses. Can you comment as to how or why the FDA would require manufacturers to anticipate likely off-label uses of their devices and file a 510K?
Yeah, they would not have to file a 510K for off-label uses. They don't have to go and say, well, it could be used this way, so I have to file a 510K. That's the guidance.
But there is something in the guidance about saying for likely uses. Is that correct?
There's something in there about if the manufacturer on their own puts a contraindication in their labeling about a particular likely use, then there's something called a changes being affected modification that they would submit to us. So it's just that one circumstance where they're actually making this change in the labeling, and it's just a certain kind of update, 510K that we would
absent the manufacturer listing it on their label as another likely use, you're suggesting that if there's some off-label use, the manufacturer is not going to be compelled to file a 510K?
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back.
Chair thanks the gentleman, and now recognize Ms. McMorris-Rogers for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Sherman, for being here. This is a very important discussion, and when it comes to new cutting-edge medical research, exciting new medical devices, the FDA can either help make it happen, or the FDA can close the doors to an entire industry. And as Mr. Matheson just said, the medical device industry in America is a great success story over the last 50 years. And we've been the world leader. Americans have benefited and lives have been saved. And yet today we hear, because of the FDA, we hear about delays, we hear about increased cost, increased user fees, we hear about regulatory unpredictability. And it's not the regulations themselves, it is the fact that the goalpost changes so often. And then along with that, we know that this industry is also facing huge tax increases because of the president's health care bill. We also know that it takes, on average now, 4 years longer in America to bring a new device to market than in Europe. And I don't believe that Europe is using bad tools, and I don't believe that it means that we have to lower the bar, but we do need to address what's happening. And so my first question is, do you believe that the current regulatory environment at FDA is negatively impacting the development of new medical devices here in America and sending jobs overseas?
I think the program that we have here needs to be improved so that we are actually having more devices developed over here, and that we are keeping and actually creating more jobs over here in the U.S. And I take it seriously very much from a public health standpoint. I'm a physician myself. I'd like to see more treatments and diagnostics for patients. I'm a neurologist. That space, if there's ever a space that could use more help, that's the one. But I don't think Europe's the answer. Europe actually does have a lower standard. You don't show effectiveness over there. You don't show that there's any benefit to patient. And as a result, you do have products. We are finding more products that have been approved over there, later shown through subsequent studies, often for the U.S., that it's unsafe or it's ineffective, but they don't have a centralized database of their approvals, so it's very hard to follow much of this. And there's been a growing chorus in Europe for change, particularly for high-risk devices, like the European Society of Cardiology, the British Medical Journal, all coming out to say high-risk devices should be treated more like the U.S., demonstrate effectiveness, more robust clinical trials over there, putting out guidance to clarify what to do. Believe it or not, for the need for more guidance, we put out more guidance than Europe does. So I don't think the answer is that the U.S. should become Europe. I think we should keep the American standard, but the program behind it needs to be predictable, consistent, transparent, and timely. I don't know
Do you believe that that program currently is? predictable?
No, I don't think, well, I don't think it's sufficiently predictable, consistent, transparent. And we've said that, and that's, I wouldn't be making these changes. I wouldn't have my staff spending the time to make those changes if we didn't believe it. And I will tell you, in spite of their working hard to try to get products out and the added effort to make these changes in the program, we're actually now starting to see early signs of improvement in performance. It's going to take a little time to really show bigger impact. But it goes to show you making those investments on our part can pay off dividends. But what we really need is we need the support to go ahead and do it, and then ultimately, between our changes and the extra dollars with the user fee program, we can get ourselves back on track, and we can keep the American standard.
Well, at the
but we can have a
current
better
rate,
American program.
current rate, we're going to run out of time. And I've introduced legislation regarding harmonization, and I wanted to ask you what role you believe harmonization with other countries could play in terms of getting devices to market more quickly.
I actually consider harmonization critically important. We had what's called the Global Harmonization Task Force, which was us, European Union, Canada, Australia, Japan, working on harmonization. I will tell you, most of the members of that group had felt that that group had the task force had kind of run its course. We put out a bunch of...
Now, when was this?
This is the Global Harmonization Task Force, and it put out many high-level documents that were more helpful to developing countries who didn't have a regulatory program in place or just developing, but didn't lead to a lot of true harmonization. We, the U.S., and I will tell you, I personally felt we needed to do better, and so we put a new proposal on the table for an International Medical Device Regulators Forum to broaden the participation. It can't be just those few countries, because the rest of the world was at risk of moving in different directions. We had to broaden our scope, and we had to focus on real implementation on harmonization. And that group, I will tell you, to the credit of the other members of GHTF, they agreed to it, and the very first meeting of that new forum is at the end of this month.
So are you seeing products being brought to market any quicker because of these efforts?
No, this effort is going underway. That was a problem with GHTF. We actually weren't focusing on critical questions about could we actually be relying on data submitted or, in some cases, decisions being made by other regulatory bodies in support of bringing the product here in the U.S.
Yeah, I've run out of time. Bottom line, we're running out of time, and we've got to start making it happen. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentlelady and recognize Ms. Blackburn for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you all for being here. And Dr. Shuren, I hope that you realize and appreciate that we would like to see a sense of urgency coming from you to do more than just talk about issues, but actually have some demonstrable actions. And when you talk about a global task force, when you talk about, time, as Ms. McMorris-Rogers said, we are running out of time with a lot of our constituents and their companies who complain about the way they are dealt with by the FDA. And in their mind, time is money. Now, you all in government have an additional, a continuing appropriation, but I think it is important that you realize what we see from you is that you may not get additional money. The federal government doesn't have additional money to give. Taxpayers are saying, we want to see them show some successes and some changes in behavior. And right now, perception is reality. And the reality is the FDA is a very difficult agency with which to deal. You can look at the Jobs Council, you can look at the ODE annual report, the GAO, the Venture Capital Alliance. You can look at all of these, and there are problems dealing with you and the regulatory burden that you impose and the method in which you impose that. Now, let me ask you a question. You may have seen this article about mobile devices. This is something that's important to my constituents in Tennessee. And this is from February 7th, Washington Times. So I want to ask you about mobile devices and how do you plan to move forward with regulation of mobile devices? Do you think you've got enough on your plate with that? And if you do move forward with mobile devices, do you intend to subject them to the device tax? If somebody goes out and buys their iPad and places a mobile device on that, some monitoring device on this, are they going to be subject to the device tax. So please speak specifically to the mobile device.
Yeah, so specifically for mobile devices, we actually took a very unique approach this time for FDA, where normally if something's a device, you regulate it like a device. And we said, wait a minute, why do we need to do that? Quite frankly, if there's not sufficient value added to do that, and keeping in mind the value of having certain technologies out there and recognizing the more rapid innovation cycles we see, then we shouldn't do it. So the policy we put out, and that article is dead wrong. They got it wrong, and you should see the commentary in other publications on that article saying, what was this person thinking? No, what we actually said is, while the world of mobile apps is maybe this big for devices, we're only interested in this. And in reality, what we're interested in is, it's the same thing as devices we already regulate. It shouldn't matter if the device is on a desktop versus on a mobile application. The maker of it, it's still a device. It's something we already regulate. That doesn't change it. And that's really the very narrow universe that we focused our attention on. That's essentially it. That makes a lot of sense. What we got back from comments is, can you provide more clarity on the boundaries? Give us more examples about it. But for the most part, the read we've been getting from people is that very narrow look makes a lot of sense. And for the rest of it, we've said, even if you're a device, go forth and multiply.
What about
we'll leave you alone.
expediency? Because right now it's taken about 3 years and about $75 million to get something through your process. And I have to tell you, some of the innovators that I am talking with, they don't think this was completely wrong. They saw a lot of commonalities in the article. And so I would just highlight with you, when you look at the speed of innovation that is taking place in the mobile, medical mobile applications, that you can't spend 3 years trying to get through all of your filings and reviews and the repetitiveness and switching reviewers. And sir, there is a tremendous amount of frustration with the FDA by our innovative community. So talk with me about expediency.
Sure, and again, when we're talking about the things, the mobile apps that we're looking at, it's things like you have technology that is pulling down X-rays and reading X-rays. I mean, the stuff we normally regulate, or EKG machines to measure heart rhythm. We've been regulating those for years. But when we deal with just software, we recognize, too, that the paradigm we have, the framework we have in place for devices does not work well. Actually, that was one of the recommendations from the Institute of Medicine, to look at software because it was so challenging. So maybe we don't have to get the $1.3 million fully back. We can let them keep a few dollars. But we are actually underway to sort of revisit our entire framework as regards software, recognizing exactly the point that you make, that you have these rapid changes, and at the same token, and you need to allow for that kind of business model and constant updates. Same token, there may be other ways to assure you have a good product that we might be able to avoid even looking at it pre-market. And the other is, there's a whole bunch of things for clinical decision support, things to help you make decisions, that while they could be medical devices, we're going through it and saying, leave it alone. Just leave it alone completely. And that's what we're working on by way of policy, because we agree we have to have a rational approach.
When do you think that your policy will, when are you going to have some guidance? And my time has expired. I will ask you to answer and yield back.
Okay. Our goal is on mobile medical apps to close out that one this year, and also to put out the draft policy on the clinical decision support software this year as well.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. That concludes the questions by the members of the subcommittee. Now, without objection, we'll go to members of the committee for questions. And Dr. Christensen, you've been very patient here the whole hearing. We'll recognize you first for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. But it's been very informative to sit here and listen to the questions and the answers. I wanted to follow up on Mr. Waxman's questions about the Pre-Market Predictability Act of 2011. The bill would make changes in 2 areas, in addition to the least burdensome provisions. One, to the investigational device exemption, and then second, to the procedures for appealing decisions through CDRH. On the first, the bill would change the investigational device exemption process in ways that appeared designed to permit companies to conduct studies that are not necessarily geared towards an approval or clearance decision. That seems to run counter to the company's interests. So can you explain where this is coming from, and if you know, and whether you believe a change like this is necessary?
Well, we actually find problematic the change that's put in there, because that change in standard for approving a clinical trial will mean that we will approve a clinical trial that's supposed to be the pivotal trial to show it's safe and effective, and we'll approve a trial that isn't going to be good enough, so it will go forward. And then when the product comes back in the door with the results, we won't approve the product.
Right.
And we suffered in that circumstance previously, and so we were watching our approvals of products going down. It wasn't working well. Now, on the flip side, we sort of changed that, but didn't change it well enough so that we said, look, let's stop doing it. But what we didn't allow is there may be extra questions we don't need an answer to right now, or they're nice to know, but we shouldn't worry about them. And so we put out new policy in November of 2011 to actually set that balance right on approving clinical trials, and we think that's the smart approach. That will get us to actually approving clinical trials more quickly, but appropriately. This change in the standard will actually adversely affect products coming on the market.
That was my impression as well. And the Pre-Market Predictability Act would also make changes to CDRH's appeals process to make it easier to have you as a center director be directly involved in appeals. And in fact, it appears that under that bill, you would not be doing much else other than just dealing with appeals. So can you comment on that section of the bill and what impact those changes to the appeal process would have on the center?
Well, if folks would prefer that I just work on appeals and not improving the pre-market program and making the changes we think are necessary to do, this is a good way to do it. I would actually prefer just being sent on vacation. But that's a problem with this bill. And I'll tell you, most appeals actually get resolved at the office level. In fact, of the appeals, about in the past 2 years, 26 to 28% wind up getting changed in whole or in part. So it goes to show you the appeal process can actually work.
So thank you. I just wanted to get that on the record. And on the guidance issue that was raised, H.R. 3204, the Guidance, Accountability, and Transparency Act of 2011, appears aimed at making FDA guidance development a more public process and at ensuring that they remain up to date. I think we all agree that government procedures should be as transparent as possible, and that the ability of government to make informed and sensible decisions is dependent on receiving and making use of information stakeholders. And we certainly agree that guidance should be finalized in a timely manner and kept up to date. At the same time, though, I think we all understand that the principal purpose of FDA guidance is to enable the agency to provide advice in a more timely and flexible manner than it can through regulations. For instance, when FDA learns of new information relevant to certain product approvals, the agency needs to be able to communicate this information to the regulated industry as quickly as possible. Otherwise, the industry could waste valuable time and money doing clinical trials on other work that won't necessarily help with the approval or clearance of their product. So we need a workable process that balances the need. But I'm concerned that the processes that would be required would actually make the guidance more onerous and more time-consuming. So, as my time is getting short, I know that the legislation would apply to all FDA guidances, but could you tell me how it would affect CDRH, and are there any aspects of that legislation that you agree with that might be helpful?
The bottom line is we will issue fewer guidance. There will be less predictability in our programs. I mean, there are all these additional hoops and hurdles. You have to announce that you're going to do this particular guidance 3 months in advance. We already put out, a list. Then we have to meet both before and after putting out the draft, so the cost just dramatically increased.
Right.
And where we've been trying to improve our productivity is going to go into the toilet, and we know that's not good for industry.
And if you have to issue your final guidance in 12 months. That just make you say, no, I can't do it, so.
Well, that's one of the problems, and industry sometimes asks for longer comment periods because they want more time to look at it. I can't grant a longer comment period. Modifications guidance, we couldn't be working through those issues, and if I have HHS or OMB who are reviewing it, that just adds on a lot of additional time. We understand the need to kind of try to move quickly and wrap it up. but this actually would have unintended consequences. And the other part about expanding what's under a guidance document actually can have adverse consequences for patient safety, because it includes notices that involve a complex scientific issue. Those are our public health notices that we have to get out quickly to tell the public about a big public health concern would now be subject to this good guidance practice, more onerous. So we'd have to say there's something coming up on this device. We'll announce it in 3 months. Stay tuned. That doesn't help patients.
Thank you for clarifying those issues for us. Thank you.
Chair thanks gentlelady. Recognize Mr. Bass for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your accommodation of me. I am also not a member of this subcommittee. Dr. Shuren, I represent a state, New Hampshire, with a number of important medical device manufacturers, as well as laboratories that are at the forefront of developing new medical devices, some of which are very common now in use, not only in America and around the world. And to say that some of them at least are very frustrated with the length of time and the quality of the decisions that are coming out of the FDA on the medical device side would be an understatement, and perhaps in some cases we can work together on some of these issues. But I'm here to ask you a question about a bill that I've introduced as part of, I think there are 10 altogether on MDUFA, having to do with humanitarian device reform. As you know, we haven't had nearly as much success since the 1990s in developing humanitarian devices for rare diseases as we've had with the orphan drug program. Just 55 devices compared to 350 orphan drugs. But that isn't FDA's fault or the industry's fault. There are flaws in the law that chill investigator and sponsor interest and demand targeted reforms. The bill that I have agreed to introduce, H.R. 3211, the Humanitarian Device Reform Act of 2011, would lift the profit restriction on current law but maintain FDA's current oversight of humanitarian devices. The act would simply do it for adult HDEs, what the 2007 pediatric device law has already done for pediatric HDEs. Today, there is evidence that this has already led to more interest in pediatric HDEs. My question to you is, do you agree that lifting the no-profit restriction on adult HDEs while maintaining FDA oversight is a win-win reform that would encourage more innovation, ensure safety, and result in more treatment for rare disease patients?
So the honest answer is I don't know what the ultimate impact would be on the flip side for pediatric devices. We happen to agree with you that there is a need for more incentives to develop devices for these rare conditions. I know the National Organization for Rare Disorders has said, look, lift the cap on adult products. That makes a lot of sense. I have the American Academy of Pediatrics, who's concerned that if you broaden it, then manufacturers won't make devices for the pediatric population. And we have seen a 5-fold increase in companies coming forward to actually get a 5-fold increase in designations for humanitarian device exemption for pediatric indications. So this is exactly the kind of topic, quite frankly, that we agree Congress should be tackling. We'd like to be a part of that conversation. We suggest get all the players in there, because I don't think we have enough information to make a firm decision, but we fully support this is an area that it's critical that we take a closer look at.
Well, I appreciate that, and I would appreciate the fact that you're willing to work with me and other members of the subcommittee. I would point out that there are other patient groups that disagree with AAP, and that the reality is that we could really benefit significantly if we had an honest debate and could work out some sort of a legislative remedy for this. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. Thank you, Dr.
Chair, thanks to the gentleman. That concludes the first round of questioning. We'll now take one follow-up per side. Recognize Dr. Burgess for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd vowed to be good today, but somebody on the other side took the first shot. So let's talk about laboratory developed tests for just a moment, and the reason why H.R. 3207 was in fact necessary, because of draft guidance coming out of your shop, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, appeared to be overstepping the boundaries. In fact, there appeared to be a basic change in the standard regulatory paradigm that had been established. And if one even wanted to draw it to its furthest conclusion, there appeared to be violations of the Administrative Procedures Act coming out of your office by issuing this draft guidance. You were going to require people to do things that had never previously before been required, and this was all happening without any legislative authority. It was simply happening upon the will and the whim of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. So I've got several letters from laboratories across the country that are in support of keeping this jurisdiction within CMS, within the purview of CLIA. The laboratory tests must be accurate, they must have clinical utility, and that is the correct place to ask these companies to go into, to literally be sucked into the maelstrom of the regulations of the devices. You can't do what you're already supposed to be doing, and you're asking for more jurisdiction. How is this helpful? How does this move anything in the proper direction? So, Mr. Chairman, I did want to submit these letters on the laboratory developed tests for the record, because again, I think this is an important part of the discussion. Maybe this legislation is not the correct final product, but this discussion needs to be part of the reauthorization of the user fee agreements. And I'll certainly allow you time to respond.
Mr. Chairman, I would just have to review those before I could agree to unanimous consent to look into, to put them in the record. I just want to have a chance to look at them.
Provide copies to you.
So laboratory developed tests, we've been clear for years. They're medical devices. I mean, it's the test. It doesn't matter who makes the test, and that's how the law is, but we have exercised enforcement discretion. But the world changed, and we have more complex tests that are actually putting patients at significant risk. I would be very interested to see the framework you're talking about, because we actually never issued draft guidance. So maybe it's another group that put it out there, but we have yet to put anything out there for people to react to. But it makes absolutely no sense to have the same kind of test that is regulated by two different government agencies depending upon who makes it. And CMS has been cleared when they looked at the legislation of this is not the right place for doing it. In fact, one of the changes under CLIA was about where you make determinations in terms of the risk on the test. And it moved from CDC to FDA specifically to reduce duplication and try to have more of one-stop shopping.
If I may,
and this actually goes the opposite direction of
no,
the concerns
sir.
we're going on.
The indications in the draft guidance that you were going to put out, that would be the duplication that this legislation is seeking to avoid. And CLIA, remember, in its inception in the late 1980s, I was never a big fan of CLIA as a practicing physician. But their whole purpose, the purpose that Senator Kennedy and others worked on this, was so that laboratory tests could be certified as accurate and have clinical utility. That's their job. Don't tell me they don't want to do their job. If a federal agency doesn't want to do its jobs, then perhaps we'll have that discussion. But this is their job. This is what they were required to do under the amendments in 1988.
No, the amendments actually don't address these issues on analytical and clinical validity. In fact, your bill now changes that, so you have to provide the data to actually show that. The problem is it's not set up in a good way to get there, and it creates duplicative government. This is actually a problem for personalized medicine. We've heard this from companies who are making drugs and then devices to actually have the devices diagnose who's the right population to get the patient. And you now have companies, they make the device, they make the drug, they do the data, everything works out and moves forward. In fact, two of them that just came out, we and our Center for Drugs, we approved it, both of those, both the drug and the diagnostic, in less than 5 months. But then the day that they go out with their test and with their drug, labs come out and say, oh, I've got the exact same thing. And in fact, we're better. Really? And so now people can go use those other tests. Who knows if they're actually any good? Because they were never tied. None of the studies were even done with the drug. It's not even out there. And so what do you have now? Now you have tests that actually may be directing patients to get a treatment they shouldn't get or not get a treatment they should get. And that's a disaster.
Well, I would submit that the duplication actually exists within your center. And albeit there's work to be done here, but to simply ignore that there's a problem is to do no service to anyone at all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence, and I'll yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Shuren, H.R. 3203, the Novel Device Regulatory Relief Act, appears to be intended to streamline the de novo process for FDA approval of medical devices. Although it's important to ensure that FDA review processes are efficient, I'm sure we'd all agree that the fundamental goal of the FDA is to ensure the safety of the public and to protect Americans from unsafe and ineffective medications and devices. The proposed new language in this bill would allow device companies to request that their new device be evaluated under the de novo process without first submitting a 510K application demonstrating its substantial equivalence to another device already on the market, which is what is currently required under the de novo procedures. And it changes the timelines under which a de novo application must be submitted. So my question is, do you think this change under this proposed legislation would add to the efficiency of your clearance process? Does it give you enough time to do the reviews for products that presumably will be more novel than most 510K submissions?
We do think that the change of not having to be required to submit a 510K before going down the de novo pathway makes sense. So taking that requirement out of the law makes sense. Giving us only 60 days to do it, however, isn't enough time. I mean, even a 510K, which is less complicated, is 90 days by law. And, you know, even that, we all know that that's not enough time for many of these as well. So not enough time, but it's the right thing to do to take out the 510K. If they don't want to submit it. Some companies you actually don't know, and they don't know, and they submit a 510K, and then we will look at it. They actually never met the requirements for a 510K.
All right, then I wanted to ask you a second question. We still have 3 minutes. As you know, the Safe Medical Devices Act of '90 mandated that FDA evaluate pre-amendment Class 3 devices and on a case-by-case basis either reclassify them to Class 1 or 2 or require them to go through pre-market approval as most post-amendment Class 3 devices. What I'd like to know is why FDA hasn't completed its mandated task of reclassifying pre-amendment Class 3 devices or requiring them to go through pre-market approval. Can you tell us how far you've gotten in this activity and how many devices remain? And are there unnecessary procedural hurdles in law that keep you from finishing this activity?
So when I came on board, we put a new refocused energy into trying to get those done, and I have on our website each of the devices that we have to go through and where they are in the process. There are 5 steps. 4 of them we've wrapped up on. Another 6 we have proposals out, and we'll be issuing some actually final rule coming up and another proposed rule. So we are marching down the list. The challenge for us are the statutory requirements to go through this process. Advisory committee meetings and doing rulemaking. In fact, this challenge, I mean, you all in legislation are telling us do this faster. This is a challenge when we have to change classification on a product. It's by rulemaking, and it cuts both ways. On the one hand, and there's a weakness with 510K. If you have a device that's in the 510K pathway and we have new data to say there are concerns safety, it should not be under 510K. It should have been under PMA, a higher classification. It will take us several years to go there. And it puts a terrible quandary on doctors and patients who are out there and have the technology and they don't have the data behind it. Or we take it completely off the market, and that doesn't make sense in a lot of cases. We want to leave it there. That process is too burdensome. On the flip side, and that's a safety issue. On the flip side, though, when we want to down-classify, so we have something in a high risk or moderate risk, and we want to make it lower risk and reduce regulatory burdens, we have so many statutory burdens on us, it's hard to do that. So it's hard for us to be deregulatory, and it's hard for us to set the bar in the right place. And if that were fixed, that would solve a big challenge. It would actually buttress things like the 510K program, where the attention goes on these few devices where there are a lot of issues, but it will also allow us to free up resources by down-classifying devices that should be subject to a lower standard.
You know, I don't, just an editorial comment, I don't envy you your job because, you know, it's the constant problem, which is on the one hand, we want innovation, we want approvals to move more quickly, but we also have to balance that with public safety. And, you know, we get it from both ends. I mean, I as a politician get that from both ends, you know. Why aren't you moving quickly? But on the other hand, everything has to be safe. And, you know, it's tough. I mean, I'm not, I know a lot of my colleagues, particularly on the other side of the aisle, have been, you know, saying, well, you know, there are too many hurdles, but you can't sacrifice public safety either. So it's a difficult quandary. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Actually, not even my dog is talking to me these days, so.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Chair has two unanimous consent requests. One, the report by National Venture Capital Association entitled Vital Signs. You've seen that
fine.
without objection.
And the other
Will be
from
in
Mr.
Burgess'
From my
letter.
colleague is fine too, yeah.
Without objection, those will be entered in the record. That completes panel one. Thank you very much, Dr. Shuren. We look forward to sitting down with you, working with you as the process goes forward. And at this point, we'll take a 5-minute recess while panel two sets up on the table. We'll reconvene in 5 minutes.
Well, it's legitimate. So the answer to your question is yes. You want to sit down?
Well, just that general premise. Yeah. Because I figure that, you know, even if, like it's on price, it's a straw going. If everybody wants to get it done, it's a process from the beginning. And that's how it's working. And again,
Did we begin meeting ASTR agreement that came in?
well, yeah, can you ask them to tell you? Okay,
There is actually a second panel to this hearing. Oh, you're back. Even the so if we catch the cliff and fall off, then we don't know any favors. But at least gave us top smoothing. Issue we what this thing looks like. Were you in the PCR or Dan Allen for the Ways and Means Committee? Oh, man, he's got criminal heart.
listen, I was last time I know some of them.
I think I had breakfast with him this morning.
And I told them, you know, for the rest of the year, they seem kind of nonplussed.
Or I told him that I'm not committed to this, but I voted for it. He said, no, you don't. Probably the same thing. But the bigger issue is, can we condense the time frame into 10 months? We were looking forward to 2 years. I don't think we can. Because one of our jobs is not just writing what this thing looks like. They're saying, any one of us can put something down on paper. But regardless, patient care, direct contact, sell this across the board. I mean, I think it would be a multifaceted but nevertheless, I still think that something we pass here is going to be warmly in place to raise our revenue. Because I hope that they're going to laugh in our face the first time they see it.
Right, just like I did.
They're going to take multiple efforts of going. You mean the Montana? Talking to them about it, soliciting their feedback, coming back and changing. I don't know if we can do that in 10 months.
Now, I'll tell you, one nice thing I had with CMA and TMA last night is to talk about an iterative process where frankly we go to their leadership and their leadership begins to push it and then we push it because this was O'Shea developed in respect to this society. So we should be able to use that, you know, to reverberate. So anyway, just to say.
But you know, when I read it, I don't know if it's changed since you showed it. So that's gonna be our, that's gonna be our challenge. We gotta work through, so we can at least let him pass the lab test with us.
Yes.
And then we've gotta go out and begin to solicit. Or changes as are gonna be dictated by practice and physician.
Yes.
Recognizing that everybody's on the same page. You got academics, you got ACOs, you got solo practitioners. I mean, all of those people have to be qualified and not feel frightened by this for it to
Yes.
actually get legs.
Yes.
I mean, my guys in Texas just want to scrap SGR and put in the eye. And I've tried that time and time again. I mean, I'll throw that up against the wall again, but it ain't going anywhere.
Well, you know, I'm Merry Christmas, you know, but there's a lot of people.
And pay for it with direct discovery, which is very similar to the OCO fund.
My secretary, by the way, back when we were okay, one hospital, public hospital, she wants to be a line item in the stimulus package, you know what I'm saying? Jane McDonald, there you go. She says, you know, I mean, no one this.
Could we pay for it with OCO funds?
I'm okay with that. So anyway, so I'm gonna start pushing prices. You and I are basically two work groups, but I figure if the work groups have well, we got sessions, we got the other, but if we have common ground,
We've got our committee,
we
but
can get into a creek.
we've got a plethora of work.
Like a pearl takes a little bit of irritation and ends up making it into a big pearl. That's your need. We're the irritation trying to do a big pearl.
We're either the irritation or the big you know what.
That's me saying you and I, but brown club. Well, the only thing I'll say is, I'm not sure Alzheimer's and dementia is just one of the big cost drivers for federal government. I was optimistic about it.
But it's worth entering these guys. I mean, that's why I wasn't here.
Believe me, I mean, it sounds equally, if not more so.
All right, JP, what do you have to report to me?
¿Qué pasa? Dígame.
You know, they did mention that last night, and I wondered if I would buy so fast.
And the summer, well, you don't care about the summer.
I'll ask all of our guests and witnesses to please take their seats. And I will introduce the second panel. First of all, thank you all for agreeing to testify before the subcommittee today. Let me quickly introduce each one of you, and you can present your testimony, summarize your statements in this order. Mr. David Perez, the President and CEO of Terumo BCT, Ms. Elizabeth George, Vice President of Global Government Affairs, Regulation and Standards for Philips Healthcare, Mr. Ralph Hall, Professor at the University of Minnesota Law School, Dr. Ross Jaffe, is it? Managing Director of Versant Ventures, Dr. Aaron Kesselheim, an internal medicine physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Dr. Art Sedrakian, an associate professor at Weill Cornell Medical College, Ms. Lisa Swirsky, senior health policy analyst at Consumers Union, and Mr. Jim Schull from the state of New Jersey. Again, thank you all for coming. We have your prepared statements, which will be entered into the record. Mr. Perez, we'll begin with you. You're recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the committee for this opportunity to testify today. My name is David Perez, and I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of Trumo BCT and Chairman of Trumo Corporation's Blood Management Business Board. And I'm responsible for leading the strategic direction, the growth, and the execution of this global organization. At Trumo BCT, we believe in the potential of blood to do even more for the world than it does today. This belief unites our organization, it inspires our innovation, and strengthens our collaboration with customers, which ultimately benefits the patients that we all serve. Working with the American Red Cross, community blood centers throughout the United States, as well as hospitals, we unlock the potential of blood as we strive to make even safer, high-quality transfusions available to people. We help our customers bring even more treatment options to patients with advanced blood therapies, and we support researchers in developing cell therapies that may fundamentally improve health care. I want to thank you for convening today's hearing and for your interest in improving medical device regulation for patients in our industry. Over the course of the last year, members of this committee have demonstrated their focus on improving the efficiency and effectiveness of FDA regulation, and your outreach to the agency and to the policy proposals that have been introduced show your commitment to this important issue. The medical technology industry is an American success story. Our industry directly employs more than 400,000 workers nationwide, including 22,000 in the state of Pennsylvania, 20,000 in New Jersey, and over 11,000 in my home state of Colorado, making these among the states with the largest med tech employment. In 2011, our company alone added 297 jobs, 224 of which were in manufacturing. Whether the firm is large or small, success in our industry comes only from innovation, the creation of diagnostics, treatments, and cures that extend and enhance lives. While we're very proud of our contributions to the U.S. economy, we're even more proud of our contributions to improving patient care. Even though we are making progress in improving patient care and see immense future opportunities, we're also very worried. Today, America is the world leader in medical technology, but there are warning signs that our lead is slipping, and a key factor in our loss of competitiveness has been the decline in the FDA's performance. Put simply, FDA is a crucial partner to our company's efforts to bring safe and effective medical devices to patients. Without a strong, effective, and efficient FDA, we cannot have a strong and competitive industry. While the FDA has consistently maintained an excellent record of assuring the safety and effectiveness of the products it reviews, delays in product approval, inconsistency in the review process, and the resulting downstream effects on investment and innovation have undermined the competitiveness of our industry and harmed patient access to new treatments, diagnostics, and cures. I'm pleased to be able to report that after extensive negotiations, industry and FDA recently reached an agreement in principle for a new user fee package, which we believe has the potential to help achieve meaningful change in FDA performance through groundbreaking accountability and transparency measures. The FDA leadership, and Dr. Shuren in particular, have recognized the need to vigorously address the issues affecting the Device Center, and I want to applaud them for this commitment. The user fee agreement is a huge step in the right direction. It is good for industry, it is good for the FDA, and most of all, it's good for patients. The user fee agreement builds the conditions for success in a number of major ways. For the first time ever, this user agreement establishes average total time goals for FDA product review. All previous agreements have set goals in terms of time on the FDA clock. What matters to companies like my own and patients is the time it actually takes to get the product to patients. By setting this in place, this new goal will be helping the FDA focus on the metric that is truly the most important to all concerned. The agreement also includes process standards that we anticipate will improve the consistency and timeliness of the review process, independent of the specific time goals. And the agreement provides for meaningful pre-submission interactions where agreements reached will not change, so that companies know what the FDA expects and the FDA is bound by its commitments. And a new procedure, what we call no submission left behind, will be instituted so that if the FDA time target is missed, the company and the FDA will meet to work out a schedule for resolving remaining issues so that the submission doesn't go to the bottom of the pile. The agreement also provides for greater accountability so that FDA success will be transparent to FDA management, to industry, to patients, and to Congress so that any problems that arise can be corrected promptly. There will be quarterly and annual reporting on key metrics both FDA and the industry have agreed are very important. In addition, this agreement requires an analysis of FDA's management of the review process by an independent consulting organization coupled with an FDA corrective action plan to address opportunities for change and improvement. Finally, to give FDA additional tools to meet these goals, the agreement provides $595 million in user fees, additional reviewers, lower management to reviewer ratios, enhanced training, and other resources provided by the agreement will give FDA what it needs to improve performance. I appreciate the committee's work and its focus on enactment of this reauthorization package as soon as possible, and once again, I thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize Ms. George for 5 minutes for opening statement.
My name is Elizabeth George, and I represent Philips Healthcare as their Vice President of Global Government Affairs, Regulations, and Standards. I want to start by thanking Chairman Pitts and Ranking Member Pallone for holding today's hearing. I also want to thank you for your particular interest in medical innovation and for leading a policy discussion on how we can work together to collectively improve the medical device user fee program. It is clear to me that we all share the goal of getting safe and innovative products to U.S. patients in a timely and predictable manner. Philips Healthcare employs over 15,000 hardworking Americans in cities and towns across the country. We are just one in a global industry. Philips Healthcare's current activities are organized across 4 businesses: imaging systems, patient care and clinical informatics, home healthcare solutions, and customer services. We have appreciated your steadfast support in ensuring the access to medical technology and particularly imaging and its important appropriate use for patients. I have worked for Philips Healthcare for more than 15 years. I've managed strategic planning and technical aspects for global affairs, regulations, and standards. I've also served on multiple FDA advisory panels through the years and have most recently represented the medical imaging industry during the MDUFA negotiations with the FDA. As an industry negotiator, I am pleased to talk with Congress today about the agreement in principle between the medical device industry and FDA. We believe that this agreement will facilitate improved transparency and consistency, leading to better predictability and more timely access for patients. After negotiating for more than a year, we believe that this agreement is balanced and is fair to all stakeholders. We hope this package will lead to a timely reauthorization of the medical device user fee program. The goal of this agreement is to ensure timely patient access to safe, effective treatments and diagnostics. Although it is not formally proposed to Congress until it receives full administrative approval and the FDA completes its public commenting period, the package as negotiated includes commitments from the agency that will improve the device review program through additional predictability, transparency, and accountability. In a time of tremendous advances in medical technology, the agreement enables the industry to bring innovative, life-saving technologies to market faster so that patients receive the highest quality care. The explicit goal of the device user fee program has been to achieve more timely clearance of safe and effective devices by providing the FDA with supplemental funds to independently evaluate applications. However, despite clear congressional intent, FDA performance has declined steadily over the past several years. For example, fiscal year 2006, it took an average of 105 calendar days to make a final decision on a submission. The number increased to 154 days in 2009, despite the fact that the user fees had increased by 50% over the same period. The decline in timeliness has been an overarching concern for industry. Our goal in this agreement was to reverse this downward trend and to ensure value for our user fee investment for both patients and innovators. The increase in resources to the agency under this agreement corresponds to more timely approval process, which will benefit patients and the manufacturers who develop these innovative technologies. The agreement includes several new quantitative goals to hold the FDA accountable. These goals include total time for decision as well as improved annual targets for 510(k) applications. The agreement also works to ensure an improved review process that is more predictable and transparent for manufacturers, patients, and other stakeholders, such as through enhanced clarity in the pre-submissions process, enhanced guidance development, and an independent assessment of the FDA's performance. These improvements are important for patients, innovation, and jobs in America. I believe it's important that Congress do everything possible to encourage high-tech 21st century industries like the medical device manufacturing that will continue to create jobs and necessary to grow the U.S. economy. We're very appreciative of members of this committee who have held a series of hearings and introduced a number of bills in an effort to respond to these concerns and improve the FDA review process for medical devices. I believe that our collective efforts will lead to constructive improvements. Thank you for your consideration of these important issues. As the legislative process moves forward, we look forward to continuing to work with Congress and the administration to ensure patients are guaranteed timely access to medical technologies. I again thank you for this invitation.
Chair thanks gentlelady and recognize Mr. Hall for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to address you on these important issues of medical device regulation. I serve on the faculty of the University of Minnesota Law School. I'm also part-time counsel with Faegre Baker Daniels and am CEO of a 4-person startup company. I'm here to focus on two matters: the agency's authority in the area of medical device regulation and the safety performance of FDA in its actual review. I believe it's important to differentiate between questions of authority from questions of implementation. Authority is whether the agency can act or has the power to compel action, while implementation goes to issues such as resources, skill sets, timing, processes, etc. The user fees that are under discussion specifically today primarily address implementation challenges and are intended to address those. On the authority front, the agency has extensive authority for the entire life cycle, or as we call it, total product life cycle, of a device from initial design to final obsolescence. There are, of course, improvements, some of them which have been discussed in the de novo process or HDEs, for example, but fundamentally, the agency has the current authority to require products to meet the statutory standard of a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. This is true under both the 510(k) system and the PMA system. There are differences in how we achieve that objective or that test, but that same statutory standard applies to all products. Along the same lines, the agency has extensive post-market authority. Examples include the MDR system, the 522 orders, MedSun, registries, and there have been discussions about registries. It's important to note, again, on the authority front, that the agency currently has the authority under the 510(k) system to mandate patient registries for products for which it believes such registries are appropriate and valuable. The agency likewise has extensive authority in the areas of recalls and dealing with product issues, including the authority to ban products where that's necessary and the authority to mandate recalls. The major question then is how is the agency performing on the safety aspects? I leave to others the issues of impact on innovation, timeliness, predictability, etc. We've performed a study looking at medical device recalls. We've analyzed 5 years of data. We're actually in the process right now of analyzing another year's worth of data that is not yet completed. The conclusions of this study is that the agency is doing a very good job on the safety aspect. The vast majority of products that get through their system do not have significant safety issues. It is obvious and critical to remember that all medical devices have risks, and the statutory standard is a balance between the benefit and the risk of the product. So one of the key aspects and requirements of the system is to identify the risks so that a knowing balance can be made between the risks and the benefits. And when you look at the data, you can see that greater than 99.5% of all product approvals do not result in a Class 1 recall, that the majority of recall safety issues that do occur are post-market issues, manufacturing mistakes, labeling errors, et cetera, and that changes to a pre-market system obviously can impact events that take place after product approval. Quality systems are the key to improving product safety. Of all recalls, as we've looked at the data, approximately 90% of all of those have some relationship to quality systems, and improvements in quality systems, therefore, provide the greatest leverage. Very preliminarily, we've looked at 2010 data, as I mentioned. That data seems consistent with what we've seen to date with the other data, with a slight increase in manufacturing issues. We're not clear if that's statistical or not. We've also taken a look at Class 2 recalls, and preliminarily, the reasons for recall appear to be consistent between Class 1 and Class 2 recalls. So in conclusion, the agency has multiple control points to ensure product safety and effectiveness, not just one. Quality systems, pre-market approval, post-market approval. The agency has authority, extensive authority, both pre- and post-market, and the agency's safety record has been very good over the past years. Thank you very much.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Recognize Dr. Jaffe for 5 minutes for opening statement.
Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, members of the subcommittee. Got it. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Ross Jaffe. I am a physician trained in internal medicine who for the last 21 years has had the privilege of working to help develop innovative medical technologies. In my role as a physician and venture capitalist, over the last few years, I more and more frequently face a frustrating paradox. On the one hand, we live in a time of incredible innovation in science and medicine that I see embodied in fascinating technologies every day. On the other hand, more and more often, I am forced to turn down many of these important medical innovations because our unpredictable regulatory system here in the U.S. has stretched development timeframes and increased capital requirements needed to fund these technologies, precluding adequate investment return for my investors. It's important to note that our investors are primarily university endowments, foundations, and pension funds, which rely on us to generate a positive return on their capital. If we do our jobs well, not only do patients benefit and physicians have access to more innovative medical technologies, high-quality jobs are created, universities can educate more students, foundations can do more good works, and people can retire in greater comfort. A real win-win-win system that supports medical innovation in the U.S. economy. Colleagues of mine who have testified during previous hearings have described how most medical innovation comes from small venture-backed companies. However, the growing uncertainty with the FDA has dramatically reduced the amount of investment available to fund innovative medical companies. According to data from PricewaterhouseCoopers, in 2007, 116 early-stage companies raised approximately $720 million in initial financing. In just 4 short years, that investment amount has dropped by more than 70% to just 55 companies raising only $200 million. To put this in perspective, 2011 saw the lowest level of venture capital investment in medical startups in the last 16 years. In a recent survey by the National Venture Capital Association, which has been referenced this morning, 42% of healthcare venture firms expect to decrease investment in medical device companies over the next 3 years. In addition, 31% of firms expect to shift healthcare investment and operational focus away from the U.S. towards Europe and Asia. In both cases, regulatory challenges here in the U.S. were cited as the primary factor for declining investment and driving investment overseas. Indeed, it is now common for many innovative life-saving technologies, for example, percutaneous heart valves, to be available for patients in Europe years before they are available to patients here in the U.S. Fortunately, within the last year or so, the FDA leadership, including Dr. Shuren, has acknowledged how regulation is slowing innovation and driving product development overseas. They have begun internal efforts to improve FDA processes, as illustrated by a series of draft guidance documents released over the past few months. One notable effort seeks to make explicit FDA considerations and risk-benefit determinations for pre-market approval. Under the law, FDA is supposed to assess medical technologies to ensure that the probable benefits are greater than the probable risks. Unfortunately, over the past few years, many FDA reviewers appear to be applying a different standard, weighing the probable benefit against any possible risk, which is not the standard in the law. If implemented appropriately, this guidance should make risk-benefit determinations more patient-centric and evidence-based, and therefore improve the transparency, consistency, and accountability of FDA decision-making. And I was pleased to hear today that that should be moving forward very quickly in the next few months. Beyond administrative changes under consideration by the FDA, the MDUFA reauthorization being discussed at this hearing will include additional process enhancements as well as needed resources to increase the predictability of the process. However, resources alone are not enough. We also need meaningful operational improvements, not only through MDUFA, but also through additional legislation that leads to better application of the least burdensome principle, streamlining of the de novo process, and revision of conflict of interest policies to allow more leading experts to sit on FDA advisory panels. In closing, let me be clear about one thing. We are not asking for increased regulatory predictability, consistency, or efficiency at the expense of public safety. Innovation and safety are not a trade-off. It is not an either-or. We absolutely need both. As investors, my colleagues and I pursue medical innovations precisely because they are safer and more effective for patients, preferably when they also can reduce healthcare costs. We need to work together to assure a regulatory system that supports the timely development of innovative products and therefore enables safer and more effective patient care. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Dr. Kesselheim, you're recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the Subcommittee on Health, thank you very much for the chance to share my thoughts with you today about the regulation of medical devices. I'm an assistant professor of medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School in the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics. One essential question being addressed in today's hearing is whether requiring the FDA to loosen its standards for medical device regulation would encourage innovation and help patients. Some offer the European Union as a model because high-risk devices generally make it to market sooner and more easily there. The main reason is that EU device approval usually only requires studies in small numbers of patients showing the device appears to be safe and performs as expected. Such evidence could include demonstrating that a new stent expands appropriately in the coronary artery. There are no requirements in the EU that companies demonstrate that their devices benefit patients. By contrast, the FDA requires more robust evidence of safety and effectiveness for many of these implantable or high-risk devices. Thus, approval for this same coronary stent might require showing fewer cardiac events or the need for another invasive cardiac procedure. The current EU system for approving medical devices recalls the U.S. prescription drug market before 1962, when the FDA only required limited studies of purity or safety before a drug could be marketed. But after the thalidomide public health crisis, legislation gave the FDA authority to compel reasonable safety and efficacy data before a new drug could be sold. This reform was almost derailed by accusations that it would threaten the viability of the pharmaceutical industry, but what happened instead was that the U.S. pharmaceutical industry grew into one of the most profitable in the world. Why? FDA validation meant that physicians could prescribe drugs confident that a neutral expert body had certified their efficacy and safety. Requiring companies to demonstrate that their products were effective also created an incentive for manufacturers to impose a higher standard on their product evaluation, leading to their developing some of the most important medications we have. And today, nobody seriously advocates returning to a time when we essentially let any drug on the market and then figured out afterwards which ones were useful or dangerous based on haphazard patient experience. But this is indeed what is happening now in the EU for approval of even the highest risk medical devices. For example, the French company PIP is now under criminal investigation for using non-medical grade silicone in breast implants. PIP silicone implants were never submitted for marketing in the U.S. Or take the case of the Plurisil lung sealant system, which was approved in the EU in 2007 to treat air leaks after pulmonary resection surgery. A clinical study conducted as part of an FDA pre-market approval application showed in 2011 that it had triple the rate of adverse events compared to standard techniques. As a result, the device was rejected by the FDA and a worldwide recall was initiated. Or the CoreCap's cardiac support device, a harness for patients with heart failure to improve their cardiac output. The device was granted EU approval in 2000, but a pivotal U.S. pre-market trial conducted by 2004 showed no change in mortality, had numerous irregularities, including missing data for about 40% of patients, and it was not approved by the FDA. Thus, FDA-required pre-market testing helped identify unsafe or ineffective devices or prevented companies from introducing substandard products, sparing U.S. patients from being exposed to them. But the FDA approval process is not perfect. Rigorous pre-market testing cannot identify all safety concerns, and the FDA must use a least burdensome approach in working with manufacturers to decide what clinical data will be required. In addition, experts have identified the clearance of high-risk devices through pathways designed for low-risk devices as an important inconsistency between the FDA's mandate and practice. Thus, patient safety also requires enhanced post-market testing of new devices. In the drug world, one of the lessons from the Vioxx episode was that safety surveillance cannot be dependent on the receipt of adverse event reports alone. More active post-market device surveillance would include development of national registries with mandatory reporting of all implanted devices, along with automatic review of clinical experiences for certain devices after a period of years to ensure that they are producing the expected benefits. With today's advances in informatics and epidemiological surveillance techniques, this would not be problematic in terms of either cost or regulatory burden. In summary, patients and physicians do not want access to any latest drug or device. Rather, they want access to products that have meaningful clinical benefits with reasonable assurance of safety. The Medical Device User Fee Act should bolster this essential role of the FDA by increasing funding for inspections of manufacturers, hiring of more reviewers or safety experts, and by providing for more rigorous post-market surveillance so that devices proven to be effective and safe can be used confidently by physicians for the benefits of their patients. Thank you very much.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Dr. Sedrakian, you're recognized for 5 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Pitts and Ranking Member Pallone and members of Subcommittee. It's a pleasure to talk today. I'm Art Sedrakian. I'm an associate professor at Weill Cornell Medical College, and I'm directing a patient-centered comparative effectiveness research program that is focusing on safety and effectiveness of devices. In my career, I've been exposed to worldwide regulatory, academic, and manufacturing perspectives. In the past decade, we've seen a lot of groundbreaking devices that change with practice medicine. However, at the same time, we've seen a number of high-profile failures of approved medical devices. And many of these failures occurred through this pathway, which is called substantial equivalency pathway, which is 510K pathway. The mere presence of this pathway creates an environment that is making people prone to committing errors. The absence of funding for robust post-market surveillance infrastructure is an even more important issue that we need to consider. If we're to have a Center for Devices for Radiological Health recognize the limitations of this post-market surveillance infrastructure today, and they set up a program called MDUFA, Medical Device Epidemiology Network. And they also created a new entity that will look for a specific example in orthopedic devices called International Consortium of Orthopedic Registries that is planning to bring together 15+ nations and registries from around the world to create an infrastructure that will enhance post-market surveillance in the area of orthopedic devices. However, there is limited funding to sustain and replicate this effort in many other areas. The absence of robust post-market infrastructure system, in absence of that, we need to make only gradual adjustment to the balance of pre- and post-market evaluation. It's important for us to build these large comprehensive registries and registry consortia, and also advance the registry science. The process will ensure evidence-based innovation and will protect manufacturers as well. Only after we build this strong post-market surveillance infrastructure and accumulate evidence of device performance and variety of types of device performance in a real-world setting, we can make those adjustments at the pre-market threshold. Let me discuss the issue of, that shows the limitations and for both pre-market and post-market infrastructure and the investments we have to make to ensure that we don't get disasters in the future. There are over 270,000 hip replacement devices used in the country. And this is a very safe operation. there are some devices that are very successful and have 95% success rate over a 10-year period. Even in this environment, where there's very successful devices on the market through 510K path, and new devices were introduced, so-called metal-on-metal devices, and a specific example is the ASR device. The device has been approved through the path of substantial equivalency and used a predicate device of the same company that, if you look closely, does not really resemble the original predicate device. It has gone substantial transformation. However, the iterative cycle this product entered the market because you could creates a predicate creep, that you can use one predicate as a predicate for another device and then so forth, and create this vicious cycle for bringing device that might be dissimilar to the previous device. That has been approved. Without any evidence, these metal devices were quickly adopted by surgeons. And the registries around the world reported really disastrous outcomes with this particular implant. The Pew recalled 93,000 of these devices out of the market, and the evidence has been summarized in our BMJ paper and also well covered by Barry Meyer at New York Times. Interestingly, there will be more than 50,000 additional patients that will undergo these serious revision surgeries in the next 10 years. And this is going to cost American taxpayers billions of dollars of additional costs. And this has, I'm not aware of any discussion between CMS and manufacturers to cover side effects related to faulty medical products. So I have some graphic pictures in my testimony that show that these revision surgeries that are happening are not really trivial problems. People have substantial suffering related to these procedures. And I have to also note that even though European registers were the first and Australian registers were the first to see these problems, they're not necessarily the best registries that we have today in the world, and we should build much more robust infrastructure system in this country and sometimes multinational infrastructure to be able to prevent this happening in future. And one of the most important ways that we can do that is through public-private partnership, and public-private partnership that can be led by FDA and involve this stakeholder partnership with the manufacturers and insurers. Thank you very much.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Recognize Ms. Swirsky for 5 minutes for opening statement.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Lisa Swirsky, and I'm a senior health policy analyst at Consumers Union. Consumers Union is the publisher of Consumer Reports magazine and Best Buy Drugs. We also have a Safe Patient Project, which has embarked on a campaign to improve the safety and efficacy of devices. We're also a member of the Patient, Consumer, and Public Health Coalition, which is a broad coalition of public interest groups interested in the safety and efficacy of drugs and devices. And some of our comments today reflect the broader interests of that community. Consumers Union urges Congress to take a balanced approach to reauthorizing MDUFA, focusing both on the real need to keep deficient devices off the market, while also providing timely access to safe and effective devices. Safety failures, such as those that occurred with metal-on-metal hips and surgical mesh, resulted from failures in the device regulatory system, particularly the problematic 510K process. But we would also urge Congress to understand that behind those failures, there are real people. Lana Keaton is one such consumer. She was a previously healthy woman who was treated for what was a pretty routine condition for women, middle-aged women, incontinence. She went in for surgery for insertion of a synthetic mesh bladder sling, which is a product that was cleared through the 510K system. She woke from surgery in extreme pain due to complications from the mesh, and she's had to undergo 17 surgeries, and she has one upcoming, another one upcoming. CU urges Congress to remember the experiences of hundreds of thousands of people like Lana who've been injured by defective devices as it considers reauthorization of the medical device user fee program. Our priority is that these devices work and that they don't hurt people. And we believe that with proper resources, we can have a streamlined, timely system without sacrificing safety. To this end, we would ask Congress to strengthen the premarket approval process for devices. In particular, Congress should pass legislation ensuring that recalled devices cannot be used as a predicate for subsequent devices. Congress should also shore up the system for monitoring devices once they are already on the market by providing FDA with the authority to require post-market studies when it deems necessary to ensure the safety of devices, and also to improve post-market surveillance tools such as Sentinel and the adverse event reporting system. CU has reviewed provisions of the agreement as described in the minutes from the FDA's January 31st meeting with industry, and we offer the following comments and concerns on the outlines of the agreement in principle. Overall, we feel that the user fee amount is inadequate. During the course of negotiations with industry, the FDA indicated that it would need somewhere between $770 million to roughly up to $1 billion to implement some of the program enhancements that industry was asking for. Now, while we understand that FDA has since scaled back those proposals in light of the lower than expected user fee, nonetheless, a lot of those program enhancements still remain in the agreement, and we are concerned that as long as they remain in the agreement without dedicated funding, they will become an unfunded mandate on an agency that's already struggling under to meet current requirements. And we would ask that if Congress thinks that these enhancements are beneficial, that they appropriate adequate funding. We also are concerned that the agreement overemphasizes the achievement of performance goals when device applications are reviewed and processed within a reasonable time frame because the application is sound and the device is safe and effective. This is obviously a win-win for consumers and industry. However, there is no mention in the agreement that these goals are conditioned on the overall quality of the products, the complexity of the products, the benefit of the products to consumers, or really any factors that may be relevant to protecting the public health. Notably, the word safety does not appear once in the minutes from the meeting where industry and FDA came to agreement. We consider this a striking omission given recent notable safety lapses by the device industry. Even more worrisome, the agreement in principle references total time to decision goals based on calendar years in addition to the goals based on FDA days. Current performance goals stop the clock when the FDA sends an application back to a device manufacturer when the agency needs additional information. Under the agreement, the FDA is kept on the clock even when it needs to get further information. CU opposes any kind of binding of the FDA to get the information that it needs to ensure the safety and adequacy of devices. We have further concerns about provisions in the agreement that call for incorporating the patient perspective into risk-benefit considerations. The industry has requested that groups that represent patients with a specific disease represent the patient perspective. However, in our experience, many of these patient groups are heavily funded by industry. Patient representatives used for these purposes should be held to conflict of interest standards and should be required to disclose any financial ties with industry. And finally, as Congress considers MDUFA, we urge it to provide a direct seat at the table for consumers in future reauthorization negotiations. While the parallel stakeholder meetings that FDA conducted with consumer groups was an advancement over prior authorization processes, they still kept consumers at arm's length from negotiations that have significant implications for the public health. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady, and now recognize Mr. Schull for 5 minutes for opening statement.
My name is Jim Schull. I'm from Browns Mills, New Jersey. I'd like to thank the committee for allowing me to speak here today. My story goes back to 2005 when I was told I had a hernia. I awoke in the recovery room from the surgery in excruciating pain. 2 days later, I was in such pain that I couldn't stand up straight or barely walk. I called my surgeon's office and he told me to meet him at the emergency room. He took me into an examination room, looked at the surgical site, and told me that it was very infected. He prescribed an antibiotic and morphine for the pain, but nothing seemed to help. The infection was so bad that I had streaks running down my groin. I continued to call the surgeon over the next 2 weeks, only for him to tell me that I'm a slow healer. At my 6-week follow-up, I explained again to my surgeon that I was in unbearable pain, so he decided to inject my groin with Novocaine right through the incision and sent me back to work. The pain I was feeling was if there was a sharp object left inside of me. After continuously going back to the surgeon, he decided to send me to pain management, where over the course of 6 weeks, the pain doctor injected my groin upwards of 70 times. Nothing would help the pain, so I decided to investigate myself. I went back to the surgeon and explained to him what I had found. Only then did he tell me that he had put a synthetic mesh inside of me and told me that it was not the mesh because the mesh was inert and my problem has to do with the nerves in my groin. I tried to go back to work because I couldn't afford not getting a paycheck, but the pain was so unbearable that I ended up in the ER. The doctor in the ER did a CAT scan only to find nothing. That's because the mesh is transparent and cannot be seen on X-ray. The doctor in the ER told me that I probably had diverticulitis and that I needed to follow up with a GI specialist. Those tests came back negative also. I decided to get a second opinion from another surgeon and asked if he could remove the mesh from inside of me. He told me that he couldn't remove the mesh, but could do an exploratory surgery to see if the nerves were stitched up. The surgeon did cut and tie off one of the nerves in my groin and thought that it would ease my suffering. After returning to him for 6 weeks in unbearable pain, he told me that there was nothing else he could do for me, so I was on my own. I finally did find a surgeon in another state, and he agreed to see me. When he examined me, he told me that he knew exactly what was going wrong with me, but to be sure, he sent me to have an MRI. I went back to this surgeon, and he showed me the problem. There it was, a hardened piece of synthetic mesh inside of me. So finally, after 2 years of unbearable pain, I found someone who could give me some answers. The surgery to remove the mesh took 3.5 hours. When I awoke in the recovery room, the surgeon was at my bedside. He told me that he was sorry and that I would be in pain for the rest of my life. The surgeon explained to me that he had removed a balled-up piece of concrete from my groin. That mesh had hardened and balled up and had encapsulated the other 2 main nerves in my groin. In order to get the mesh out, the nerves had to be severed. He explained to me that the mesh was so hard that when I moved, it was acting like a saw and cutting into the surrounding tissue. I had a 3-inch gash in my pelvic floor, along with hundreds of smaller cuts and tears. In 2008, I was diagnosed with a degenerative nerve condition. The pain that I suffered through on a daily basis consists of constant burning, sharp pains in my groin and upper thigh. My groin and upper thigh are purple and brown in color because of the nerve condition I now have. I must take 3 strong medications, OxyContin, Percocet, and Tramadol, just for the pain alone. Every 6 months, I have to have radiofrequency ablation done at the spinal level where the nerve roots are located. It's very uncomfortable for me to sleep at night without the help of medication. Because of this product, I'm no longer able to work as a printer. When I was a teenager, I had a hernia. That hernia was not repaired with mesh, but was stitched back together. 34 years later, and I still have no problem with that repair. The mesh that was put inside of me caused so much damage that none of the nerves will ever be able to be repaired and will never grow back. I live a life of pain because of a product that never had any kind of clinical testing and slipped through the back door of what we know is the 510K process based on the use of predicate devices. I'm left disabled because the FDA considered the surgical mesh equivalent to that of sutures and allowed it to be implanted in patients like me. After years of people reporting problems and investigations into synthetic mesh, the FDA published a public health warning. Unfortunately, the warning was only for synthetic transvaginal meshes that are used in women. There was no public health notification for hernia meshes, which are just as tragic and cause horrible complications for men and women alike. Failing to address the hernia mesh issue puts too many people in danger. I think synthetic mesh should not be on the market because it's unsafe, and I have proudly taken the challenge to work to prevent this from continuing to happen to others. In closing, I would like to say that I am only one face in thousands of people that this has happened to. And the sad part of it all is that I feel that I may be one of the lucky ones. This committee can change the laws to improve the safety of medical devices and put patients first. Surgical mesh and other medical devices should be tested for safety before they are allowed to be implanted into people like myself. We also need a national system to track what happens to patients like me after devices are implanted to catch these problems as soon as possible. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentleman, and thanks all the panel for your testimony, and we will now begin questioning. And I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for that purpose. Dr. Jaffe, you presented some very compelling data in your testimony, and it reiterates what we have been hearing from medical device innovators who have testified for this committee and those we speak with back in our home districts. PwC reports show that in 2007, 116 medical device startups had $720 million in funding, and that last year, 55 companies received under $200 million. This reflects more than a $500 million drop in funding of medical device startups. Can you explain the impact of this alarming drop in funding, the impact on patients and jobs?
Thank you, Chairman. Let me start with the we'll start with the jobs issue first. Clearly, you know, each of these companies may only have 5 to 10 employees at startup funding, but if they're successful, they'll grow. And many, you know, successful medical device companies we're involved with have hundreds of employees. We also know from data that for every one job we create in a company, there are 3 or 4 jobs created in the community to support those jobs. So clearly there's an economic impact. The more important issue, though, is really the impact on patients and potential technologies for those patients. I have an unusual job in the sense that I invest in things I hope I never have to use personally. And I hope none of you or your loved ones ever need any one of the products we develop. But if you are someone with the issue that our technologies address, you'll be very grateful they were developed. And the sad part of all this is that there are many technologies that I mentioned earlier that I see every day that deserve development that I can't pursue because the time and capital requirements would be too great to allow me to generate the returns I need to satisfy my investors' requirements. And it's a challenge of the system that we all need to work on.
Thank you. Mr. Perez, can you give us an example of difficulties your company has had with the FDA? Have you experienced an increase in how long it takes to get through the FDA process? And why do you believe that doubling the amount you pay in user fees is going to solve what is, you know, it's partly a management issue?
Well, I think the performance metrics that are specifically addressed in the MDUFA agreement go back to some of the issues that we've had with the FDA. I'll give you an example. We had a pre-submission hearing with the FDA on a technology, and then we went almost 14 months before we heard back from the FDA, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that there was just not agreement within the FDA on how to go forward with the approval process on a product like this. And this specific MDUFA agreement addresses that when we have a pre-submission meeting, there has to be agreements, and those agreements can't be changed. We had another example where we had an agreement with the FDA on a clinical trial. We moved forward on the clinical trial. We got about halfway through the clinical trial, and the requirements for that trial were changed. So once again, I think some of the things that we're trying to address regarding predictability, accountability, and are specifically addressed in this MDUFA agreement. And I think some of the challenges that we have, I'm not saying they're all going to go away, but I think some of the specific challenges that we've had will be addressed with this new agreement.
Ms. George, how does the proposed user fee agreement improve predictability and consistency with respect to FDA's review of medical devices, if you can be specific?
I believe that there are a couple of areas that it does that. First off, that through the pre-submissions process, as was stated by Mr. Perez, there would be agreement as to what the requirements are ahead of time, early, prior to submission, so that the manufacturer, when they submit their 510K, it includes the requirements up front so that it can flow through the process more quickly. I also think that the interaction requirement that we've put into the agreement of having earlier interaction with the FDA so that we know what the questions might be if they're going to have them, that will support it. And then the added management as through the resources that are going to be added, that will ensure consistency in how they make those determinations so that a reviewer by themselves doesn't have to make that decision.
Professor Hall, from what I understand, FDA has extensive post-market authority for medical devices. Would you walk us through that authority, please?
There are a number of authorities the agency currently has. They include obtaining information through medical device reports, so-called MDRs, the MedSun process, which is an active post-market surveillance system linking about 350 hospitals. There's a 522 order process. You have special controls that specifically include the statutory authority for post-market surveillance obligations, patient registries, and other tools. In the PMA world, you have conditions of approval The QSR systems include post-market surveillance. We call them CAPA, corrective and preventive action processes that, for example, require product trending, root cause analysis, et cetera. So those are just a number of the statutory systems that are currently in place.
Thank you. My time's expired. Chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Plone, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask Ms. Swirsky and Ms. George, only because of time limitations, about these advisory committees and the conflict of interest. As you know, industry and some patient groups have focused on removing limits on how many experts with financial conflict of interest may serve on the committees. Many consumer groups are concerned that for FDA and the public to be confident in the objectivity of the advice FDA receives, every effort must be made to minimize the number of conflicted experts that serve on these committees. I think I'd like to ask Ms. Swirsky, if you can, if you could suggest ways that FDA could broaden its pool of experts. And, well, let me start with that, and then I'll go to Ms. George. How would you suggest that FDA could broaden its pool of experts?
Well, I'd want to say, first off, I think the FDA has already suggested that those caps on the waivers, which I think are the subject of many of the bills in the House and some in the Senate, haven't really been at issue. They're not using the existing caps.
Right. She mentioned that when we had the commissioner here last week.
So that suggests to us that there's some broader problems other than...
Right. Well, just give me your suggestions, because I don't have a lot of time.
I'm sorry. So the COI, some of our suggestions, I think this would actually, we would hope that the FDA might actually, this would be a ripe for a task force to bring in stakeholders, various stakeholders, consumer groups, and industry to sort of come together to look at some of the barriers and identify some solutions. But some of the solutions I think that I know that we and other consumer groups have thought about is first of all, creating better awareness of advisory panels. I think right now there isn't great awareness of it, and so what you have now are self-selected folks who a small pool of self-selected folks who sign up for these advisory panels. And some ideas include trying to work with medical schools to make this a part of their curriculum so that we can create more prestige around the advisory panels. Obviously, we can pay them more, which is probably not in the cards for this for the short term. But also I think there's a lot of evidence that about 50% of academic researchers aren't conflicted at all. So we need to tap into that pool, and research suggests that academic medical centers have fewer conflicted members, and so bringing them in to the process and creating and getting their input on how we can make it more attractive to them.
Thank you. And Ms. George, first I wanted to thank you for coming to that FDA roundtable we had at Rutgers with the commissioner. But would you explain why elimination of the caps on waivers would be helpful, given, as Ms. Swirsky said, that the FDA hasn't come anywhere near to reaching its cap to date? Do you think it would be helpful? And if you want to comment on broadening the pools also, but
one of the challenges, I think,
because I have one more question. Another
one of the challenges I think that the panels that does occur with the panels is anything that goes to panel is innovative. It's new technology. It's new clinical science, and there are not a lot of available people out there to actually come in to be those experts, to come in and answer the questions, to be able to ask the industry the questions. So one of the challenges that we have when as a manufacturer, if we bring something to panel, is we've probably already tapped a lot of those people to help us in the development and in the creation of the technology or science, and so the FDA has limited people available that they could use. So that does cause some aspect of conflict.
Okay. Let me ask Mr. Perez, I have one more question here. I've got a minute left. I understand the negotiation over the medical device agreement wasn't easy, and but we've heard from the Drug and Biologics Trade Associations that they're committed to a clean PDUFA, and while they may have some additional legislation they'd be happy to see enacted as part of the UFA legislative package, they don't want anything that would slow down or jeopardize the passage of that package. So I just want to ask you, does AdvaMed share that same philosophy? Are you committed to seeing that nothing slows down or stands in the way of passage of MDUFA as part of the package of FDA legislation? I'm asking you to take the same pledge, if you will.
Well, I think we share a common goal here, that we want to get this done in a very timely manner. We know many members have already introduced some legislation, all in an effort to improve and help the FDA be more successful. But I think right now we need to make sure that we balance those efforts with trying to get the MDUFA agreement passed in a very timely manner. So we would like to work with the members of the committee to listen to them, but I think it's very, very important we get this done. Dr. Shuren outlined a timetable, and I hope we can stick to it.
All right, thank you so much.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the Vice Chairman of the committee, Dr. Burgess, 5 minutes for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Perez, valid point, and what a lot of people don't realize about the user fee agreements is when they expire on September 30th, this is not like the typical congressional action where we can say the dog ate my homework, and so I'm going to give myself an IOU for the next couple of months. These are voluntary funds that are provided by the industry, and without the user fee agreement in force, those monies simply stop on October 1st. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So this timeline that we're looking at now is one with a great deal more severity than the usual congressional timelines. I mean, I forget, we had, 35 different temporary patches to the FAA reauthorization in the last 10 years. We can't do this.
I agree. We got to get it done.
We got to get it done. And so that's why I appreciate all of you being here and Dr. Shuren being here, because I think this is, we may disagree about some parts of this, but we all understand how important it is to get this done. Dr. Jaffe and Dr. Kesselheim, let me just take advantage of the fact that you two are sitting next to each other, and you seem to have vastly different views of the world. Is there any you've both heard each other's testimony. Is there any common ground between you, or are we left with this rather stark definition on either side of what an ideal user fee agreement would look like?
Well, I don't know where the differences are between us on the user fee agreement. I think I certainly didn't hear any concerns about the need for more resources for the FDA and for process improvements.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think that the need for greater funding for a lot of the essential work that the FDA does is essential, and I would, it would be my preference to see that money come directly from Congress. But since that's not going to happen, I think that the user fee agreement is essential, and a lot of the issues here we'll deal with, by improving the.
Now, let me interrupt you in the interest of time because they've just called a vote. But Mr. Jaffe, Dr. Jaffe, you describe a world in which the risk-averse nature of the agency charged with protecting the public interest, the risk-averse nature has damaged your business model. Is that correct? Did I misinterpret that?
Yes, Mr. Congressman Burgess.
And Dr. Kesselheim, your view seemed to be that it doesn't matter about the damage. We have to prevent, because these companies are out there trying to push products out on the American public, the unsuspecting American public that are bad products, and the FDA has got to stand as the last bastion of defense against the public and these bad products. Did I miss something in the testimony of you two individuals?
Well, so I would first say that for many products in the 510K clearance process, for 95% of products, the time to market in the U.S. and the EU is not different. That what we're talking about are the highest risk products that arrive at the EU market sooner. And I think, as I said before, the essential reason for that is that they're just not being tested before for efficacy and for useful outcomes.
Dr. Jaffe, do you agree with that?
I don't fully agree with that, I must say. We do go to Europe early because there's a more straightforward path, but we do test products in Europe. They do have to have data to get approved. We have a company selling in Europe a leadless cardiac defibrillator, which could be a major improvement over the problems we've had with leads here in the U.S. That product's been on the market for 3 years in Europe, and it'll probably be several more years before it's approved here. We do clinical trials.
Let me ask you something. Do they have a post-market surveillance program in Europe?
The company is continuing to do studies. I'm not sure. I'm not directly involved, and I don't know if they are required to. But the company has continued to do studies of that product, both in Europe and it's completed a clinical trial here in the U.S., which is submitted.
Now, will that company be able to use any of that data when it goes to the FDA to present its case?
I do not know the answer to that question. I'm not directly involved.
Mr. Hall, do you know?
It's possible, assuming that it meets the U.S. criteria for informed consent, data, validity, et cetera. But there are many situations where the data can be used.
Now, I've got a list of a number of things where the post-marketing authority exists in the device world and is missing from the drug world. Now, there's some things where drugs and devices share some post-marketing authority, things like adulteration, misbranding, manufacturing changes. Both drugs and devices are required to report. But you look at things like classification based on risk, devices have it, drugs don't. User reporting, devices have it, drugs don't. Reports of removals or corrections, devices have it, drugs don't. Tracking, devices have it, drugs don't. I mean, it looks like the Food and Drug Administration is already applying many of these standards in the device world, maybe even a little bit more stringently than the drug world. Do you agree with that, Mr. Hall?
There are obviously a number of differences between drugs and devices. The agency has a plethora of post-market authorities in the device world. Some of them do not exist in the drug world. In part, that's because of the differences between drugs and devices. You don't have an implantable drug, as a general rule.
Sure, you do for some hormonal agents.
Right, as a general rule, I was trying to say.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and recognizes the ranking member emeritus, ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, 5 minutes.
Thank you. I will be emeritus when we get the control back, and then I'll be chairman. But thank you very much for calling on me, and I thank this panel for their testimony. I had a chance to review some of the testimony, and I've had my staff here throughout your presentation. Dr. Kesselheim, I must express alarm over your article describing the harms caused by the devices approved in Europe first, and then later found to be ineffective or worse or harmful to patients. This is important information for us to have, given that so many in the device industry have complained that FDA is depriving Americans of the innovative devices patients in the EU get so early. Obviously, as you've shown, this is not always such a good thing. Your New England Journal article also describes what are some critical fundamental differences between the EU and the U.S. systems. You say that the EU system is a part of a framework for commerce, which originated as a means of streamlining trade and coordinating manufacturing, safety, and environmental standards, end quote, in the EU. Your article also states that so-called notified bodies, which are for-profit independent companies that specialize in evaluating many products, not just medical devices, are not, quote, designed to work as public health agencies, end quote. And the approval standards in the EU are quite different from ours. Device manufacturers have only to prove that the device works as intended, not that it's effective at treating or curing the particular indicated condition. So, yet in recent months, many have argued that we should reformulate our device regulatory system so that it more closely resembles the EU. Let me ask you, based on what you have learned from your study, do you agree that we should look to the European system as a model for how we regulate devices in the U.S.?
Absolutely not. There is no evidence that I've found in all the places that I've looked that suggests that the model for device approval in the EU in any way benefits patients overall as compared to the U.S. system. And indeed, these notified bodies have major problems with conflicts of interest and their independence. And in fact, they only evaluate devices for approval, whereas the competent authorities in the EU are the ones charged with safety evaluations. So the safety and the approval evaluations in the EU are separate, and that's just not the way to effectively protect the public health.
Some of the bills that are being proposed change FDA device regulation to make our system look like a lot more like the EU system. Let me ask you about one of them that would expand the device center's so-called third-party review program. Currently, that program permits third parties to review certain 510K applications and provide recommendations to FDA on whether the agency should clear a particular device. FDA has 30 days in which to make a final decision, but it's FDA that has the final say. That's existing law. One bill has an alteration of this scheme to make the third party's recommendation binding on FDA. If FDA fails to respond in 30 days, the bill would also expand the types of devices that these third parties are permitted to review to include, quote, permanently implantable or life-sustaining or supporting devices, end quote. These outside reviewers are not currently allowed to review these devices. Dr. Kesselheim is an expert on the U.S. and EU systems of medical device oversight. Do you believe this legislation is a move in the right direction? Would you be concerned about these kinds of changes to the program?
Yes, I believe this is definitely a move in the wrong direction, and I would be concerned about these types of changes. First of all, there's plenty of peer-reviewed evidence showing in the drug realm that decisions made at the end of a fixed regulatory period end up more likely leading to drugs that have safety problems later on down the road. So imposing this 30-day fixed time limit on the FDA in terms of devices is bad policy. And I also think that that increasing the role of these independent agents into the evaluation of the most highest risk devices would again move us more towards the EU equivalent notified bodies, and would be bad policy. I mean, there's very little, individual oversight of what these notified bodies are able to do. Manufacturers are able to game the system in a way and select which notified bodies they want to based on which are known to provide a faster path to approval. And I just think it would be a bad idea.
Mm-hmm. It's ironic that Governor Romney is attacking President Obama, saying he wants us to be more like the Europeans. That may or may not be right, but in this case, we don't want to be more like the Europeans. The FDA gives a seal of approval that's respected all around the world for our drugs and devices, and you think in the area of devices, we are better able to protect the public health with our present system.
Indeed, I do. Sure. And in fact, a lot of the European authorities rely on the studies done for FDA approval in order to make decisions about payments and use of the devices there. So indeed, authorities around the world rely on the FDA system.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. We're going to try to wrap this up. We're in the middle of a vote. Dr. Cassidy, 5 minutes for questions.
Mr. Hall and Dr. Jaffe, just to be on record, are you all in favor of this bill, of the number 3, if you will?
The MDUFA reorganization? Reauthorization? Yes.
So you feel, and Mr. Hall, are you? I'm sorry.
The agency needs adequate resources. I am Don Quixote on this. I prefer the funding to be from public sources. I recognize the practical aspects and problems with that right now.
Okay, that sounds good. Now, Dr. Kesselheim, I think William Osler said, let's use our drugs while they still work. And that was obviously way back when there was poor regulation. You suggest that still may be true in Europe of medical devices. And Dr. Jaffe, obviously, there's a tension there that was earlier alluded to. I'm way out of field. I'm a gastroenterologist. But don't I recall something I was looking on and couldn't find it, that there was an artificial disc that was being used by maybe orthopods or spine surgeons that has been implanted in lots of folks and turned out not to be efficacious? Do I remember that correctly, or am I?
As far as I'm concerned, yes, there have been examples of those sorts of orthopedic spine devices that turn out later to have been unsafe or not work, yes.
Now, Dr. Jaffe, how would you, understanding there has to be a kind of movement towards innovation, but understanding that there are these instances where things are not efficacious, yet they're approved and they're putting a lot of people and they cost a lot of money, how would you balance that tension?
Congressman, I just want to stay clear that we have not advocated for any type of European system here in the United States, and we still believe the importance of good clinical safety and efficacy studies. The challenges we have with the FDA are less around those standards than they are about the unpredictability and the delays and the difficulty in getting decisions made that cost our companies millions and stretch timeframes in a great distance.
So then you're not so concerned with the paradigm that they use, rather how they implement it, if you will.
Exactly. It's more how the internal management. That's why these guidance documents that Dr. Shuren referred to are so important. Making the clinical risk-benefit determination much more transparent and clear and accountable, so we can review over time, make sure that we're in agreement at the start and we're still in agreement at the end of the process using the same standards. Because we've seen standards change as reviewers change. We've seen delays in getting to decisions. We see sometimes.
So I've limited time. So Dr. Kesselheim, again, I'm just kind of curious about this. And again, I'm trying to dig from the recesses of my memory, so if I say something stupid, it won't be the first time, but at least at the same time. Somebody has pointed out to me that some of the things that are approved, maybe certain types of stents for cardiac disease, turn out not to be efficacious. But there's no vested interest in terms of learning efficacy in terms of your outcome data if your outcome data is mortality, it's a long study, very expensive, et cetera. Surrogates may not be adequate markers for the ultimate outcome. And Dr. Cedric, I think I saw you nodding your head. Would you all comment on that? Because again, I'm trying to understand this issue. I'm not challenging anybody, I'm just trying to understand.
I can answer that. In many situations, it's possible that a device will take time until side effects will develop, and large number of products will be already on the market with consequences for public health. Now, the best answer to that kind of problem is to have a worldwide network that will help us determine the side effects early.
Now, but this isn't so much side effects as lack of clinical efficacy. It may decrease angina, for example, but it may not prolong life. Do we just not put do we need 10,000 people and 5,000 get a stent and 5,000 don't? Do you see what I'm saying? Can we use surrogate markers?
I mean, I think that there are surrogate markers that have been validated as relatively well predicting final outcomes, and in those cases, surrogate markers are useful. And there are also, new techniques for doing randomized trials and detecting efficacy so that they can be done in a more expedited way. And I'm also, more in favor of promoting an efficient and predictable FDA regulatory process as well. But I think that at the end of the day,
Let me cut you off, because I told my colleague I'd give him the remainder of my time, because I think I got your point. And Mr. I'm sorry I didn't get to you.
Thank you. Thank the gentleman for yielding. Dr. Kesselheim, if I could just ask you very quickly, are you currently involved either with the plaintiff or defense in any of the product liability lawsuits involving, say, the artificial hip?
no.
Same question to you, Dr. Sidraki.
No.
Mr. Shaw, let me just ask you, your story, very compelling. Certainly, at some point, there's been a lawsuit involved, I would assume?
Yes,
And currently, your lawsuit is against whom?
that's settled.
It's settled. That is, with whom did you settle?
That would be the doctor.
The doctor. Was the product that you referenced in your case, was that product ultimately recalled from the market?
No, it was never recalled.
Did you file suit against the company?
I did, but the product was deemed used off label. And
So it was the physician involved, not the company?
the company exchanged testimony for me to drop the suit against them.
All right, I thank you for that. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks to the gentleman. We have a unanimous consent request.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record first the testimony from public citizen, second, testimony from the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and third, 2 New England Journal of Medicine articles, 1, post-marketing surveillance of medical devices filling in the gaps, and second, regulation of medical devices in the U.S. and European Union.
Have you shared that with those, without objection? Any objection? Without objection, so ordered. That concludes second panel. I would like to thank the witnesses, members for participating in today's hearing. Remind members they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record. I ask the witnesses to respond promptly to the questions. Members should submit their questions by the close of business on Thursday, March 1st. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.
Hi, we didn't meet. I'm Ross Jaffe.
Nice to meet you. I think one of the best cases for a venture capital investment is disposable.
5 minutes is not enough to tell what happened.
It helps to really innovate better and not face what the PV space.
Yeah, no, understood. And we'd love to see, I have this view. I mean, I'm not going to say it
Thank
here
you.
because you don't want to go there. But I actually think one of the challenges we have with truly innovative long-term devices that have long-term